Hey, my spookies, I hope you're having a great Friday and you're ready for an enjoyable summer weekend. But before we get into the heat of a good time, I think it's time to get a little chilled to the bone. So I've taken it upon myself to gather up 5 of the best summertime slayings Weekly Spooky has ever featured. Oh, these stories are just as chilling as they are hot. And they're cheaper than your air conditioning bill because they're free. So kick back right now with a story of wanton love and vengeful spirits, courtesy of Charles Campbell from Horror 421. Make sure to check out his podcast at Horror 421, by the way. This one is creepy and a whole lot of fun, and I feel like it really brings you to that summertime feeling. So we'll be checking out the spirit of Langley Pond after these quick messages. The Spirit of Langley Pond by Charles Campbell. Summer, 1981. Elena Ann Sanders swam for all she was worth. She could hear the echo of her mother's sentiment in her mind. Don't get into any trouble. Call me if you need me to come get you. No questions asked. Elena wished she had listened to her mother. Instead, it was nearly midnight, and she was swimming for her life to shore. Elena was beginning to think she was going to make it. She was going to see her mother again. The crack of a gunshot was the last sound Elena heard before the darkness of the water claimed her. Langley Pond was going to be her grave. Summer, 2021. Langley Pond had changed quite a bit in the last 40 years. Being billed as the largest pond in North America, it was nearly the size of a lake. No longer were clay mudslides used as makeshift boat ramps. Now, there were full-fledged paved boat ramps descending into the water. There were designated picnic areas spread around the shoreline along with a few cabins that were rented nearly every weekend. It was almost 10 o'clock at night, and the humidity of the day still hung in the air. Brianna Turner glanced at her cell phone. It was 82 degrees. Ugh, I can't believe how hot it is, Brianna said. She peeled a strand of sweat-stuck hair from her forehead and grinned at her boyfriend, Andy Spires. Andy smiled back and said, "Yeah, it was over 100 today. Thought we might get a little relief by being near the water and all. Guess not. At least we have the cabin with the window unit. That's a plus." "You're right. That's a plus," Brianna agreed. They both turned toward the woods when they heard snapping twigs and shuffling feet. "Hey, Frog, y'all catch anything?" Andy asked when he saw Frog Spradley and his girl of the week, Jenny Coggins, clear the tree line into their sight. "Had a few nibbles, but nothing big. Threw 'em all back," Frog said. Jenny smiled, but she didn't look all that happy to be traipsing through the woods. "Good thing we brought beanie weenies then," Andy said. Jenny gave him the "you can't be serious" look, and Frog replied, "Damn, man, you are a lifesaver. Beanie weenies are the shit. I thought I'd have to break out the Vienna sausages and saltine crackers." "Hey, Jenny, you want to go in the cabin and cool off?" Brianna asked. "Yes," Jenny shouted. It was hot, she was sticky, and if this excursion with Frog taught her anything, she was definitely an inside girl. The boys watched as the girls walked into the cabin. "Okay, Frog, where'd you find that one?" Andy asked. Frog gave him a sneaky smile and sheepishly shrugged his shoulders. "Come on, man. I don't recognize her. She ain't one of your usual valley honeys." "She's from Martinez," Frog whispered. "Why are you whispering? She can't hear us out here. What in the world were you doing in Martinez? And how'd you get her? She looks too sophisticated to be stomping around Langley Pond." especially with you. The Prince of the Valley. She don't know nothing about the valley, does she? Andy asked. Well, she does now. I told her about the spirit of Langley Pond, Frog replied. You didn't. And she hasn't left screaming? Not yet. Maybe it's because her phone died while we were fishing. She seemed more interested in whatever was on Instagram or Facebook than catching a catfish. Inside the cabin. Oh my God, that AC feels fantastic, Jenny said, and stuck her face in front of the window unit. It was turned all the way up, and Jenny's sandy blonde hair blew behind her like she was riding on the back of a motorcycle. Yeah, it's the only cabin out here with one. Andy sprang for the extra $60, said it would be worth it to sleep in comfort, and he ain't wrong. It's sticky as hell outside. How long you and Frog been seeing each other? Oh, I just met him yesterday. Where are you from? You ain't from the valley. Valley? What's the valley? Jenny asked. You're in it, Brianna answered and continued. You know that main road you took to get here? The one that went through a bunch of little bitty towns? Yeah, Jenny replied, and turned to face Brianna. Brianna was grinning, and her brown eyes were gleaming. Jenny really paid attention to Brianna for the first time, and she had this country girl pretty thing going for her. She looked like she could be fun in the sack, but could kick your ass out of it if necessary. Well, that road is 421, and 421 is the valley. Rednecks for as far as the eye can see. And you got yourself what we call a valley prince. That right. Why is he a valley prince? He's a Spradley, and Spradleys have been around the valley for as long as anybody can remember. Everybody calls him Frog. I don't even know if that's his given name, but I know his daddy was called Frog, and his daddy's daddy was called Frog. They own several businesses in the valley. His brother Ricky owns Valley Video. His other brother Johnny owns Spradley's fill-in station in Langley. His sister Darnell, well, she owns a beauty shop in Gloverville named, can you guess? Spradley's Beauty Shop? Jenny asked as she shrugged her shoulders. Yep, nailed it. So if you're from the valley, you know who the Spradleys are. Oh, really? That's good to know. So what do you know about this spirit he was telling me about while we were fishing? He didn't tell you about the spirit of Langley Pond. Please tell me he didn't try to scare you with that story. Brianna suppressed a chuckle. He did, and it did freak me out a bit. Is there any truth behind it? From what I've heard, these local legends start with a grain of truth somewhere, and that grain grows and gets exaggerated over the years. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Am I wrong? Should I be afraid of a ghost in the pond? Jenny asked. Brianna smiled and motioned for Jenny to take a seat in the living room. Yeah, I know about the grain that started the story. It was something that really happened about 40 years ago. It went something like this. Summer, 1981. It was Friday morning, and Elena bid her mother farewell for the weekend. Her mother's voice issued a lifeline as Elena walked out the door to meet her boyfriend, Dustin Hines. Don't get into any trouble. Call me if you need me to come get you. No questions asked. Elena told her mother not to worry and that she would be home on Sunday night. Hey, babe, Dustin said as Elena hopped into his Ford pickup. She leaned over and gave Dustin a quick kiss before she pounded the dashboard, which meant it was time to burn rubber. Dustin pulled out of the driveway and beelined to Belvedere Clearwater Road. Finally! Elena shouted. She was ready to have a weekend alone with Dustin. They had been talking about it for the better part of 6 months. Elena leaned her head out of the open window to feel the wind in her face. Hey babe, watch out for telephone poles. You don't want to get your head knocked off. It would really, put a damper on the weekend, Dustin said as he tugged on Elena's arm. Okay, I'm just excited, that's all. I know it's just Langley Pond. Just Langley Pond? Just Langley Pond? You know it's the pride of the valley, Dustin said. He looked at Elena with his blue eyes, and he could see her melt, just a little. You're laying it on a little thick there, ain't ya? Everybody knows Richardson's Lake is the pride of the valley, she said, enamored with her man. I beg to differ. You can't put a boat on Richardson's Lake, and I really don't know how they can call that tiny mud puddle a lake anyway. Langley Pond should be a lake. I mean, it's as big as one. Speaking of boats, Elena interrupted, does your daddy still have that John boat at Langley Pond? He does, Dustin smiled. Trolling motor? In the back of the truck, Dustin answered. Sweet, Elena replied. The pair rode in silence for the next 9 minutes. Elena hopped out of the truck as soon as it rolled to a stop just inside the confines of Langley Pond. I can't wait to jump in the water, Elena screamed and shed her clothing as fast as she could, revealing her bathing suit underneath. Dang, girl, you ain't gonna wait for me to put up the tent? Dustin asked the air. Elena was already splashing in the water. Dustin set up the 2-person tent and pulled the trolling motor from the back of the truck. Elena swam to shore when she saw the tent was all set up and the trolling motor was attached to the John boat. Hey, babe, we gonna do some night fishing? The bass should be popping top water plugs tonight, Elena said as she took a seat in the lawn chair set outside the tent. I reckon we can do that. Mama packed up some ham sandwiches in the small cooler and I got Pabst in the biggin. I love you, Dustin. Shut up, you do not. You just want me for my money, Dustin joked. The couple ate sandwiches, drank beer, let their food and drink settle before they made clumsy love in the tent. Elena fell asleep with Dustin's arms wrapped around her. She woke up 5 hours later, alone. Dustin? You outside? Elena asked as she rubbed her eyes and stretched. She shuffled out of the tent and heard the frogs croaking their night tunes. The crickets returned a symphony of their own. Dustin! Where you at? You know you can pee in front of me, Elena shouted. She looked around and was comforted that the truck was still parked in the same spot, so Dustin didn't decide to go on a midnight snack run and leave her out here all alone. But he didn't answer her, and that was a reason for concern until she saw the light from the flashlight out in the middle of the pond. The John boat wasn't there. That sorry sack of potatoes, Elena shouted. Dustin, get your ass back over here and pick me up. She hollered into the night toward the light of the boat. The light flashed in her direction, but the boat didn't move. Don't make me swim out there, Dustin. I swear I will, and I'll make so much noise that no fish is going to bite for the rest of the night. Don't test me. Elena was leaving playful and moving into pissed off. The light flashed in her direction once more, but the boat still did not move. Okay, I'm coming. Elena sloshed into the pond and began swimming toward the boat. The boat still didn't move. The longer she swam, the angrier she became. He better not dare ask for sex the rest of the trip, is what she was thinking. Not even a hand job. The light still shined like a beacon from a lonely lighthouse. Elena was about 30 yards away from the John boat when she realized something was very, very wrong. There was a figure standing in the center of the boat. A figure that was a mite bit shorter than her boyfriend. That was their John boat. But that wasn't Dustin. Elena swam a little closer to see if she could make out who it was standing in the boat, and screamed in horror when she saw what the man was holding in his left hand. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of joke. Her mind was telling her someone was just pranking her. The man in the boat swung his left arm up, around, and launched the severed head of Dustin Hines in Elena's direction. She waited what seemed like hours on the sound of the splash. And when the sound came, Elena turned around and swam for all she was worth. Elena felt as if bricks were weighing her down. The burning in her lungs felt like she inhaled lit gasoline. She could hear the echo of her mother's sentiment in her mind. "Don't get into any trouble. Call me if you need me to come get you. No questions asked." Elena wished that she had listened to her mother. Instead, she was swimming for her life to shore. Elena was beginning to think she was going to make it. She was going to see her mother again. The crack of a gunshot was the last sound Elena heard before the darkness of the water claimed her. Langley Pond was going to be her grave. Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back. Summer 2021. Jenny's face was flush when Brianna finished the story. "Was that true? What you told me?" she asked. "Pretty much. I don't know if that's exactly how the conversations went down, but the facts are Elena and Dustin went to Langley Pond. Dustin's head was chopped off. They found the body in the boat, and Elena had been shot in the head. It took them a while to find her body, though. Longer than it probably should have. They say her body was in the pond long enough for her spirit to be trapped here. Some people say they can hear splashing around and hollering sometimes. Me, I think it's just the bass having their late-night snacks. They can make quite a ruckus when they're attacking frogs, lizards, and whatnot. I wouldn't let it scare you too much, though." Brianna finished and patted Jenny on her hands. "Did they ever catch the guy that did it?" Jenny asked. "Well, that's the thing. They did. That's how we got this story that's been passed down for 40 years, but he was shot in the head with a long-range rifle as he was escorted to the courthouse. Let's just say the police didn't spend a lot of time looking for the killer of Billie Jean Morris. From what's been passed down, a lot of folks think it was set up that way. The police can turn a blind eye sometimes when it comes to valley justice, especially when it's a couple of local kids that were killed. Kids that everybody knew. Kids that everybody loved. There were some rumors that it was Elena's daddy or even Dustin's daddy. They were both avid hunters with rifles to do the job. They weren't even questioned. I don't blame either one of them if they killed Billie Jean. He deserved it," Brianna finished. Jenny looked at her in all seriousness and said, "What if Billie Jean didn't kill them? What if someone else did? And what if that someone else is still around?" Jenny asked, clearly working herself up into something that Brianna thought was silly. "Calm down, girl. It was Billie Jean. I know it was Billie Jean. It's a valley thing. You wouldn't understand. Now let's go see what those boys are up to." Frog was grinning from ear to ear as he saw the girls approach. Andy was downing another PBR. "I was beginning to worry about you two. You get your girl talk in?" Frog asked as he grabbed his own PBR. "Yeah, something like that," Brianna replied and winked at Jenny to let her know it was okay. It was just a stupid local legend. Nothing to worry about. "Frog, are we really having beanie weenies for dinner? I mean, I'd rather go to the store and grab some sandwich stuff. Maybe Brianna and I could run to the grocery store real quick. We'll get a bag of ice and some more of that beer y'all like." Frog was all set to disagree and force the beanie weenie supper, but when the B word came up, he changed his course of thinking. "I think that'd be okay. What do you think, Andy? The girls can go get the sandwich stuff and another case of beer. I'll contribute $10 for the cause," Frog said and pulled a crinkled bill from his well-weathered leather wallet. "Yeah, I reckon that'll be okay. Brianna, take her to the Bilo where Jimmy works. He'll let you buy the beer with no ID. Brianna rolled her eyes at Andy like she didn't already know that. She had bought beer at that Bilo since she was 14 years old. The Valley kids knew where to go without being ripped off. There was always the quick shop option where the owner would only sell the swill known as Milwaukee's Best for triple the labeled price to desperate teens. That's the only way he could get rid of the crap, and he had to carry it because it was such an under-the-table moneymaker for him. Any way he can stick it to the government and help raise the next generation of valley rats, the better for his valley pride and his pockets. Andy tossed the truck keys to Brianna. "Be careful, babe. Don't wreck my truck and don't get caught with that beer." Brianna gave him another eye roll and trotted to the driver's side. Jenny felt a wave of relief when Brianna started the engine and the cool air from the AC kissed her face. "Andy," Frog said with a wicked grin. "Yeah?" "I had Jenny going pretty good with the spirit of Langley Pond. You want to have some fun and scare the girls when they get back?" "More Jenny than Brianna. I know she's tough to scare." "I don't know, man. That new girl might go off the deep end. I mean, you don't know her all that well, and it'll severely reduce your chances of playing hide the snake, if you catch my drift. It'll be more like a whack-a-mole," Andy replied and smiled. "I don't care," Frog began. "I don't think she's going to give it up anyway. May as well have some fun with her. She's creeped out over the ghost of Elena Sanders." "First, what did you have in mind? And second, if Brianna gets pissed, it's on you," Andy replied. "Look, while they're gone, I'm going to go to the edge of the woods over yonder." Frog pointed to the shoreline at his left. "You see that cluster of trees over there?" "Yeah?" "Well, I'm going to go over there behind them trees and start tossing some of the red bricks that Ricky put over in that clearing into the pond. He'll never miss 'em. He done forgot he put them out there. And check this out real quick. Give me a second." Frog ran to his car and Andy could hear him rustling before he came trotting back with a palm-sized speaker. "It's a Bluetooth, man. I'm going to play some Halloween screams out of this bad boy. It works right off my phone. And while you're doing all this shit, where am I supposed to tell them you are? Tell them I went to the other side of the pond to go gigging. Brianna will believe that. She knows how much I love to go gigging. And when she finds out that's a lie, then me and my right hand are going to be best friends for the rest of the trip." "I don't think so," Andy replied. "You have to take the fun out of everything, man. Look, I will tell you that I was going gigging and I'm going to disappear for a little while. Then you won't be lying and you can act like you're just as pissed as the girls. I suspect I'll be taking Jenny home after this stunt and you and Brianna will be all alone in the cabin." Frog grinned and poked his finger through the hole he made with his other hand. A smile ran across Andy's face. "Now that sounds like a better plan, my man. I know nothing, I see nothing, I hear nothing but the spirit of Elena Ann Sanders splashing and screaming in the water." "That's the spirit," Frog replied without realizing the pun. Darkness was closing in on the valley when Andy saw the lights of his truck coming down the path. "They're back!" he shouted, which sent Frog scurrying for the tree line. Brianna and Jenny were still laughing from their conversation on the trip back. "Hey girls, need a hand?" Andy walked toward them. "Where's Frog?" was the first question from Jenny's lips, and Brianna already had her doubting eyes looking around for the mischievous valley prince. "He'll be back directly. He went gigging on the other side of the pond." "What's gigging?" Jenny asked, thinking it was some made-up thing by these valley people. "He went to kill his namesake," Brianna answered. "Gigging is when you basically take a 3-pronged metal spear and go stab frogs with them. Don't worry, though. Frog isn't killing them entirely for fun. He'll cut the legs off and fry them up." "Ew! He's going to eat their legs?" Jenny couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Yeah, I'll probably eat some too. Andy, though, he's not much on frog legs, are you, babe?" Brianna asked. "Y'all can have that. If I eat a fried leg, it better have belonged to a chicken, that's all I'll say." "Did he say when he's coming back?" Jenny asked. "Well, with Frog you never can tell. If he starts sticking them left and right, it might be a while, but if he can't catch them, then he might not be gone so long." "Is he good at catching them?" Jenny asked. "Best in the valley," Brianna replied. "Oh," Jenny said. She thought that was a hell of a way to treat your date. Send her off to get your beer while you go kill frogs around the pond. Jenny made up her mind that Frog would have to take her home as soon as he got back. "Here's your beer," Brianna said, and pulled the case from the bed of the pickup. "It's still cold. Jenny and I are going to make ourselves a couple of sandwiches. You want a ham and cheese? You know I do. Can you bring it back out here? I'm going to start a fire in the pit. It's 80-something degrees out, Andy. Do you really want to make it any hotter? I like to see the people in the flames, babe. I won't keep it lit all night. Alrighty then, go see your flame people. Come on, Jenny, I'm starving. The girls went into the cabin. Andy lit up the fire pit and waited to hear the first splash. Brianna came out 10 minutes later with Andy's sandwich wrapped in a paper towel. Did Frog really go gigging? Brianna asked. Andy truthfully answered. That's where he told me he was going, but you never know with Frog. He added that just to cover his ass for when the shit went down. All right, it's pretty dark out here now. You coming in soon? Yeah, I'll be in a little bit. I was trying to wait on Frog to get back. I'm surprised he didn't come running when he heard the beer truck, Andy said, already thinking of how fake mad he was going to be with Frog when the prank unfolded. Andy wondered if Frog would let him get a punch in just to completely exonerate himself from any involvement in his childish ploy. Just put that fire out before you come in. We don't want to be the ones to burn down the cabins. Roger that, Andy smiled and pursed his lips for a kiss. Brianna gave him a quick peck. 15 minutes passed and there was no splash, no sound from the area in which Frog disappeared. Andy was getting a little antsy as he stood from his chair, took another gulp of PBR, and turned toward the cabin. He could see the outline of the girls standing near the AC unit. Andy began walking toward the cabin when the first splash finally came. Ah, so it begins, Andy thought to himself. The girls didn't hear it, or if they did, it wasn't enough ruckus yet to make them come outside. Then there was a second splash, much louder than the first. He saw Brianna's head turn, but she didn't come outside. I guess third time's a charm, is what Andy thought. The third splash came, and it was much louder than the first two. This time, he saw Brianna move toward the door. Then came the scream. It was loud, shrill, and brief. Almost inhuman. It was a scream of severe pain. Brianna came bursting out the door. All right, Andy, tell Frog to cut the shit. Jenny's freaking the hell out in there. She's afraid to come out. Frog, cut the shit! Brianna hollered in the direction of the commotion. There were more splashes. They got louder and closer. Louder and closer. Then, the second scream. It was so loud, Andy was thinking that was one hell of a speaker Frog had brought. Andy and Brianna heard running, and it was coming toward them, very quickly. Frog emerged from the darkness, and his face was white as a sheet. Frog, you son of a Brianna began and then stopped. Her heart felt like it was going ba-boom out of her chest when she heard the next scream. This was no Bluetooth speaker. This was menacing and so full of pain. Damn, Frog, how are you doing that? Andy asked, still not getting it, actually impressed with his friend's skill. It's not me, Andy. It's Elena. And I pissed her off. Stop it, Frog. Take me home. I'm done with this shit, Jenny yelled. Her entire body was shaking. The poor girl was scared out of her mind. I think we all need to leave, Andy said as he realized his buddy wasn't joking. Andy kept calm. Let's just go. We'll come clean up our crap in the morning. There was another tremendous splash, and it was closer than any of the others. The rhythm was almost like thunder followed by lightning. A few seconds after the splash, the screech came. It was a sound of unmitigated pain. The four of them froze in place, and their mouths fell open, almost in unison, at what they saw next. The apparition of Elena was floating above the water just past the shoreline. The front of her head was busted wide open, and her eyes were contorted black pools that looked in opposite directions. She fell into the water with a loud kersplash, and slowly rose again. Her mouth opened wide, and this time, the scream pierced them. The eardrums of all four of them were on the verge of exploding in their skulls. Hands went to cover ears on instinct, but it didn't matter. This scream moved through flesh and bone, through space and time. This was the scream of the dead trapped in her watery grave. It was a macabre dance of the dead in which Elena was forever trapped. Jenny was the first to speak when the screaming stopped. "She's not going to let us leave." Brianna looked at Andy, and they felt the same apprehension that Jenny spoke aloud. But Andy simply said, "Let's get the hell out of here." Andy and Brianna ran to the truck while Frog and Jenny ran to Frog's Mustang. Andy turned the key and heard the clicking sound associated with a dead battery. Frog did the same. Jenny was shaking in her seat. Brianna was already thinking that they would just book it to 421 on foot. It wasn't that far away, and once they were on that stretch of road, they would be home free. The wind suddenly picked up and the temperature dropped. The four of them got out of the vehicles and moved closer to one another. Brianna wanted to scream, wanted to tell them to run, but something in her gut warned her that would be a big mistake. Jenny's lips were quivering with fear, and Frog didn't look like a prince at all. For the first time in his life, Frog truly felt fear rush up his spine. The calmness that Andy displayed just moments before was replaced with a feeling of despair. They all felt like Brianna, felt as if they should run, but couldn't. Not that anyone or anything was stopping them, but it just felt like a very bad idea. There was another screech, and the four of them turned toward the pond. The apparition was floating above the water just at the shoreline. Her dark hair was flowing behind her, and she wasn't falling this time. Her mouth was contorted as if she were about to release another screech, but this time, she didn't. The spirit of Elena looked directly at Frog with a face of recognition. The spirit began shaking above the water. "What the fuck, Frog?" Andy whispered. I don't know, man," Frog whispered back. She's pointing at you," Jenny said on the verge of sobbing. "No, she's not. She's pointing at us. She don't want us to be here, and I think we should give her what she wants," Frog whispered back. Andy, Jenny, and Brianna slowly stepped away from Frog. Elena's spirit kept pointing to the Valley Prince. It was recognition, and it wasn't coincidence. "What the hell, man? What did I ever do to her?" "I don't know, man, but I wouldn't make any sudden movements if I were you." Summer, 1981. He had seen Elena come in his store through the years. He longed for her, but she was taken. Dustin Hines was her man, and it didn't sit well with him. Not one bit. He heard it through the grapevine that they were going to Langley Pond for a romantic getaway this weekend, and today was Friday. Elena wouldn't give him the time of day, would barely utter a word when she came in to pick out a movie. Sometimes Dustin would be with her. She would come in with her beautiful long black hair and perfect smile, teasing him. Elena had to know that he was in love with her, but she would come in with Dustin flaunting her love for him and, in a sense, a disdain for Frog Spradley. He didn't understand why. Valley Video was going to be his outright in another year. He would be a reputable business owner. Frog was sure that the video rental business would be a necessity for generations to come. But she would come and go, tease him, taunt him, show him what he can't have, show him who was getting her love. This wasn't going to work for Frog. He would be at that pond tonight, just like the song said. Bang, bang, he shot me down. Bang, bang, I hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, my baby shot me down. And that's exactly what Frog would do. He would go to the pond. He would hear them making love in the tent. He would take his machete and get Dustin to come outside while Elena was sleeping. He'd hack him up and chop off his head. He'd take the John boat out late. He heard them talking about their late-night fishing trip. She would come out. She would see the light. She would think that her lover was fishing without her. She'd see the man that she scorned. See what she could have had. He would toss the head of her betrothed. She would see him. All she had to do was keep swimming to the boat, and she would have lived. But she turned and swam away, afraid of the man that was truly meant for her. He'd line her up with his deer rifle. Frog was a dead shot. He wasn't going to miss. He'd let her feel as if she may get away before the shot would zip through the back of her skull. It was pure luck that they pinned it on Billie Jean. He always had a short fuse, and that was all very well and good with Frog. He'd find another love, one that would love him. They'd have a baby boy, and he would keep the name of Frog alive. Frog was the spitting image of his father and his grandfather. He'd grow up as a valley prince. Frog Sr. wouldn't think of Elena again until he took his final breath in 2015, when the song floated through his mind for the first time since that day. Bang, bang, he shot me down. Bang, bang, I hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, my baby shot me down. Frog died with his loved ones around him and tears in his eyes. His family didn't know. The tears weren't for them, but for Elena, the spirit of Langley Pond. Summer 2021. The specter was transfixed on Frog, and he was in turn locked onto her lifeless eyes. Her mouth curled in pain, and it was as if she were the one seeing a ghost. Frog couldn't move. It was as if he were stuck knees deep in mud, and the air around him was infused with a coldness that chilled him to his soul. The spirit of Langley Pond seemed to know him, and she didn't seem all that thrilled that he was looking at her. "Oh my God!" Brianna screamed in Frog's direction. "She knows you!" Andy turned away from the ghost and saw the angst in Frog's face before he said, "That's impossible. There's no way she knows Frog." The ghost floated closer to them and seemed to put her feet on the ground. The entire shoreline got much colder, and the others felt it. Everyone was stuck in their spot, afraid to make any sudden movement. The four of them formed somewhat of a straight line, and they all faced the spirit of Elena, but that spirit was only focused on one of them. And she changed. The life came back into her eyes. They turned from black pools to light brown. The distortion in her face also melted away. The ghostly apparition that the four of them witnessed floating above the pond changed into healed flesh and blood. She no longer floated but walked toward Frog. He managed to utter the first words to break the silence. Hey, look, what do you want from us?" The young woman smiled at him and held out her hands. Frog wanted to believe this was just a dream, that he had drank 5 too many PBRs and would wake up any minute, but he knew that he was in the here and now. "Take my hand. You were there. You killed my boyfriend. You chopped off his head. And you shot me," Elena said and continued. "Take my hand so I can leave this God-forsaken place." Frog trembled. His brain was trying to fight the overwhelming compulsion to grab Elena's hand. If he did, he thought it might be the last thing that he ever did. Brianna found her courage and spoke. "Elena!" The girl turned to face her. "He couldn't have killed your boyfriend or you. Please, just listen to me." Elena placed her hands at her side and gave Brianna a sense of relief. She was going to listen to her. Good. Look, the year is 2021. You were killed in 1981 by Billie Jean Morris. It was in all the papers. My mama told me about it. The whole town knew it was Billie Jean. He was shot dead, Elena. They got the man that killed you and your boyfriend. Elena turned her attention away from Frog for just a moment and walked to Brianna. Jenny ran to Andy and stuck her head in the crook of his arm like she was trying to shield herself from seeing a kill in a horror movie. Elena walked toward Brianna. She seemed to admire the beauty of the girl. They were close to the same age. Billie Jean Morris did not kill me. Billie Jean Morris never talked to me. I know who I saw, and it was his face, she said, and pointed back at Frog. Shit, woman, I wasn't even born yet! Please! Frog pleaded. It was him, Elena said, and started to turn away from Brianna. Brianna lunged forward and grabbed Elena around her wrist. She was surprised that she didn't pass through her. Brianna really had a grip on the young woman. Elena spun around in Brianna's backwards hug like a slippery eel and placed her hands on Brianna's head. The memory of that night and her death filled Brianna's mind in what felt like a wave of electricity. Brianna blinked rapidly. Andy pushed Jenny away and started to run toward his girlfriend. No! Brianna screamed. Stop! Andy stopped in his tracks. Elena looked into Brianna's eyes, looking for understanding. You see, it was him. You see that now, right? Elena broke Brianna's grip around her waist and turned back to Frog. What the hell, man? I wasn't even on the planet then! It was his daddy, Brianna shouted. This made Elena pause. It is 2021. His daddy's name was Frog, and his name is Frog. He looks just like his daddy. He didn't have anything to do with it. Andy rushed to his girlfriend's side, and Jenny was right behind him. The three of them stood together. Frog was still frozen in place. Elena moved closer to Frog. She could see the man that chopped off Dustin's head. She could almost feel the bullet break open the back of her skull all over again. He put his hands out in front of him, hoping this would keep her at arm's length. She touched his hand, and it was colder than anything he had ever felt in his young life. You have his blood, and a penance has to be paid, Elena said as she grabbed the Valley Prince by the hand. I will not stay here any longer. I was waiting on him to return, and he never did. But his son will do. You carry the blood of the man that killed me. You should have never been born, Elena said, and pulled Frog closer to her. Brianna and Andy started to run toward them. Jenny was a blubbering mess. To save their friend, but it was too late. Elena had a firm grip on both of Frog's arms, and she morphed back into the specter. Frog was lifted straight up into the sky, his legs kicking and his lungs screaming into the night. Brianna and Andy shouted Frog's name as he disappeared into the sky. His screams went silent. Andy and Brianna looked at one another, waiting for another sound, another sign of life from the Valley Prince. What they heard in the far distance of the pond was a splash, a cackle, and then silence. The spirit of Elena Ann Sanders was now free. It was replaced by the son of the man that killed her and Dustin. This would be the penance that set her free. Brianna, Andy, and Jenny would never be able to explain what they witnessed. They just said Frog went giggin' and never came back. What else could they say? Are you feeling cooled down enough yet? Well, There are still 4 more stories to enjoy, and believe me, you'll enjoy them. This next one takes us to a summer camp, an idyllic situation for any summer fun, but also kind of an ideal place to be hunted and murdered brutally. This one is called Camp Dead and Buried, and it's written by my good friend and collaborator John Oak Dalton. He has a film called Girl in the Crawl Space available right now for free to watch on Tubi TV. So make sure you check out The Girl in the Crawl Space on Tubi TV. And while you're at it, go to weeklyspooky.com. Check out all of our back episodes. Check out our Patreon. Support us in any way you see fit, and we sure do appreciate it. But now it's time for Camp Dead and Buried, after these quick words from our sponsors. Camp Dead and Buried by John Oak Dalton. It was so hot. It was like the dead-ass middle of summer, but it was the last night of the year at rickety old Camp Elderberry, which everyone called Camp Dead and Buried, because it was a boring place to spend your summer. The summer camp historically closed the Friday before Labor Day weekend, and then the counselors were always allowed to stay on for one long, extended party, smoking any stash they had forgotten about and sleeping with anybody they had had their eye on all summer and hadn't made it with yet. But that was the 60s and 70s, and this was the year of our Lord, 1980 AD, and everybody needed to knuckle down and get some shit done. So in Wampanoag Cabin, commonly called Wang Dang Sweet Poontang Cabin, the senior female counselors were gathered to study for the babysitting test that was always administered by Mrs. Blonner on the first day of school that following Tuesday. Mrs. Blonner was the home ec teacher at Virgil Gus Grissom Consolidated High School, home of the Rockets, and had been administering her own handwritten test on the first day of the year since Jesus took a carpentry class. Parents came to the school to get a mimeographed list of the girls who had passed the test. And that was the make or break list for the plum babysitting jobs for the school year. Gunilla Cassidy led the study group, and included all the senior counselors and some of the hotter junior ones that might be in the crosshairs of the senior male counselors this last weekend. She was called Guns by everybody, a nickname she chose to embrace because she was a badass, and also because she was named after Gunilla Hutton from Petticoat Junction, and she would rather people forget that. Thankfully, everybody said she looked like a teenage Linda Ronstadt. It wasn't until 1978 that Mrs. Blonner found out that her test had been circulating freely through the school for a couple of decades, so she wrote a new one each year, and hard as she tried, Guns could not get a copy, and that pretty much sucked for everybody. On the other side of the quadrangle that made up the counselors' cabins was Wapahani Cabin, commonly called Wipe Your Hiney Cabin, where the junior male counselors and 2 visitors from the junior female counselors' cabin, La Jola, obviously called La Jailbait, were finishing up an epic summer-long Outcast Swords quest, with a picnic table strewn with hex paper, pencils, dice, and little lead figurines. They paced themselves to finish up tonight before leaving Sunday. Friday, the guys had wanted to watch The Incredible Shrinking Man on Channel 13, and the girls wanted to watch El Cid on Channel 8, but the girls were outvoted, 4-1, though halfway through that movie got boring and they all switched to El Cid. Later, they saw The Avengers, and then Bob Hope on Johnny Carson, and by that time, it was too late to start. Sebastian was the leader of the junior counselors in every aspect, including being in charge of running Outcast Swords all summer. His older brother Marcus, called Keys, was the de facto leader of the senior counselors, and that helped. But the 2 brothers couldn't have been more different. Sebastian was a short, lumpy, tan kid with black, frizzy hair. He was called Black and Mexican and Hawaiian and Arab and Samoan and a few other random things. Marcus also was tan, but he was tall and muscular and had long curly blonde hair and a wedge of beard cut square like King Tut. He belonged wherever he wanted to land and nobody ever asked him what he was. But their father was biracial and their mother was white, and in rural Indiana, it was tricky. "What it is, little brother?" Keys crowded the door of Wipe Your Hiney with the senior counselors. "Hey man," Sebastian gave his brother a half wave. "You guys gonna come party with us or hang out here?" Keys asked. "Hang out here," Sebastian said. "Okay, just thought I'd check. I'm going to get supplies out of the Barracuda," Keys answered. Is it any surprise Keys had a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda? Sebastian had a 1968 AMC Rambler his mom used to drive. While Sebastian's friends looked either annoyed or terrified by the appearance of Keys and the older guys, Sebastian knew that his brother had bestowed his blessing on their night of role-playing. Thus, the senior counselors would not come back in the dead of night for wedgies, swirlies, or any other rites of passage as Sebastian's friends became the senior counselors the following year. If the dilapidated old camp was still open in 1981. Either way, Keys was the lone holdout for going out in style. There was one other person thinking about going out in style, and that was the only adult left, the handyman, Mr. Little. Little lived in basically a shed in the woods, and nobody saw him unless the shitter backed up, and that was fine with everybody. He was the kind of creep that could only get a job as a handyman at a broke-down summer camp. That night, Little was thinking about the Doom Pussy. Those night flights on B-57s from Bin Hau Air Base into Laos and North Vietnam. Those pilots wore a patch that said, "Into the mouth of the cat of doom." And unless you flew a Canberra into that hellhole, you couldn't have that patch. Little was also thinking it was hotter than any night in the Nam, and the woods seemed awfully dark and close. The hooting of an owl and the sounds of crickets began to be replaced in Little's mind with the chattering of monkeys and the slithering of snakes and other jungle sounds. An M60 firing at 100 rounds a minute could really clear the woods of Victor Charlie, but all Little had was a Colt 1911 pistol a South Vietnamese officer had once owned, and it would have to do. He had a Montagnard crossbow mounted on the wall that looked like a toy, but was used by the fiercest warriors Vietnam had ever seen. Thankfully, they hated the VC more than anybody else, and made the Ho Chi Minh Trail a death trap. It might be a good night to honor their memory. In the trunk of the Barracuda, Keys had a bong he had told his mom was a sculpture, and a couple of cases of Falstaff he drove over to Ohio and bought. Big Red had a bottle of Old Fitzgerald they hadn't managed to finish. Orrin had a bottle of Galliano he had smuggled from home because his dad made Harvey Wallbangers, and that was some fucking embarrassing shit, but they would probably drink it anyway. Pete always had the good weed. He was called Havana because he rolled his joints as fat as bratwursts. Keys went back to the senior male cabin, which was really called Firehawk Cabin, and that was pretty fucking cool, so they stayed with that. They had all this sweet stuff in tow and decreed that they were putting on records. It was Keys' record player, so he got to choose. They had started calling him Keys when they had gone to the drive-in earlier that summer and saw Three the Hard Way. Jim Kelly was called Mr. Keys in that, and it wasn't so much that Marcus looked like Jim Kelly, but instead it was more the attitude. If you were a biracial kid in Indiana in 1980 and you wanted to rock out but also keep it righteous, your choices were limited. You had Hendrix, Richie Havens, Thin Lizzy of course, but number one for Keys was Arthur Lee and Forever Changes. That was the first disc they were spinning that night. Havana still wanted to argue whether Klaatu was really the Beatles again, But every single dude there was sweating down his balls, so who gave a shit? The night before, which was the last night the kids were all there, Keyes had brought the record player down to the mess hall, and they had a disco for the young campers. Everybody was acting all cool until Keyes put on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and he and Guns went out on the makeshift floor and did the hustle, the bus stop, and the electric slide. And since they were the couple of the summer, once they did it, it was okay if everyone else got out and danced too. Keyes was still thinking about dancing with Guns when he lied to the others and said he had to go take a piss. He was going to walk straight to the Wang Dang Sweet Poontang cabin and see if he could scheme on getting Guns to go down to the lake with him, the only cool spot left in the whole fucking camp. He got close enough to see Guns through the open window, and she looked up and saw him outside, and he knew they were on the same wavelength. She said something to the other foxes in the room which he couldn't hear with the loud box fans running that somebody must have dragged back in from the Korean War or something. Then she met him outside the door, and he took her hand, and they headed for the lake. "I told them I went to get Virginia Slims," she said to Keyes. "Outside? We've been hiding them behind the rain barrel since it hasn't rained for a couple of weeks." Keyes nodded his approval, and they followed the path into the darkness. In Wipe Your Hiney cabin, Sebastian was getting his own vibe off of Melissa, another counselor who had gamed with them all summer, but on the last night with the adults gone returned to her truest form, rinsing her hair with purple Kool-Aid and wearing a Rocket to Russia t-shirt she copped off her older sister. Last night at the disco, she was looking straight at him when his brother played Kiss You All Over by Exile, and here she was looking at him again over a hand-drawn map on hex paper. Sebastian knew the tactics of how to slay a band of orcs, but not how to scheme on a purple-haired angel, and would have to channel his inner Keyes to figure it out, if he had any of his brother in him at all. Meanwhile, Keyes and Guns were getting it on in the lake. It wasn't their first time, but they both thought it might be their last. They went to schools in different towns anyway, but tonight they were the couple of the summer, and it was going to go all night. Guns thought Keyes was biting her on the neck a little, which she wasn't that into, and then it hurt a lot, and she was very surprised to look down and see a pointed arrowhead sticking a little bit into her shoulder, but all the way through Keyes' chest. Keyes' eyes were wide open, and he opened his mouth to say something to Guns, and blood poured out. Guns screamed and pushed him away without thinking. Keyes rolled and floated on his stomach, and Guns could see the arrow pointing right at the moon. There was a gust of air, and another arrow passed through the wings of her hair and nipped at the top of her ear. Guns screamed again and ducked her head under the water, her blood mixing with Keyes across the surface of the lake. She held her breath as long as she could, and then a little longer. Little was cursing himself for not getting 2 clean kills, and he was pretty sure the screaming was going to draw out every Charlie within a few clicks, so he decided he needed to hump it to the villa and conduct a Zippo raid. It was time to burn this place to the ground. Sebastian had set the last night's adventure in an ice cave to sort of help with the heat, but it wasn't really working, and everyone was sweating through their clothes, down the back of their ears, and in the crook of their knees, and had their mouths open trying to draw breath. When the first shouts came from outside, nobody had the strength to stir for a moment. But even though Sebastian was the de facto leader of the cabin, it was Jeff, who had a one-eyed fighter character called Snake after Snake Plissken, who was first out the door and thus got an arrow from the Montagnard crossbow in the chest. Sebastian stepped back and peered around the corner, one arm waving the other's back. He saw his brother's cabin on fire, and he wondered about that bong for a minute. Then he saw Orin running away with flames licking his shirt and Big Red lying still on the ground with an arrow in his neck. Somehow the record player was still spinning and was blasting out "Time Has Come Today" by the Chambers Brothers, and that in itself was pretty fucked up. Sebastian felt a stab of fear when he didn't see his brother, but went into Dungeon Master mode. He turned to the others. "Out the back window," he commanded. The others complied quickly, while Sebastian watched, but Melissa turned and grabbed his arm, and a different shock ran through Sebastian to his heart. "Come on!" she yelled. The others dawdled for a moment at her cry, but then a flaming arrow hit the doorframe and they all took off again. Sebastian looked into her eyes and shook his head. "I'm going to draw them off. You book it for Gun's cabin, she'll help you." Before she said anything else, and before Sebastian could think too hard, he ran through the open cabin door and started zigzagging, just like he did when his own character Wiglaf the Thief was under siege by those elven archers in Rivendell. Okay, he stole that 11 archers part from Lord of the Rings, but he was the only one who had finished the whole trilogy and everybody else couldn't get through Dune. Sebastian could hear arrows whistling around him, and that was fucking scary. But he saw the gravel road that led out to Highway 3 straight ahead. Suddenly, Sebastian tripped and fell into a small hole. Something hurt real bad, and Sebastian looked down and saw a sharpened spike sticking out of the top of his foot. It smelled strongly of piss, and Sebastian remembered reading that back in Vietnam, the Viet Cong would set punji stick traps and pee on them to make sure the American soldiers got infections. No elven archer had ever pissed on a punji stick, so suddenly Sebastian was out of his element and realized he had fucked up. Meanwhile, Gun, swimming one-handed, had pulled Keys to the rocky outcrop in the middle of the lake the kids called Thunder Island after the song. Guns liked the part of the song when he sang about the girl being the color of the Indian summer. Guns realized her mind was drifting and her scalp was bleeding, so she shook her head to clear it, causing a lance of pain and a shower of blood. She looked to the far-off shore and saw the glow of a fire. Keys didn't look good, but Guns thought it looked worse over there. So with one last look at Keys, she dived back in and started stroking for shore. Sebastian saw somebody walking towards him in the gloom, backlit by fire, carrying a motherfucking bow and arrow. Sebastian pulled at his leg as hard as he could, and his foot came off the punji stick trap, and he puked all the peach fago and corn chips he had consumed that night, and in some ways, that felt worse than anything. Sebastian tried to run, but kind of hobbled more so, though thankfully he was in the tree line in a few seconds and the bang, bang, bang of a pistol was close by, but also seemed thankfully far away. There was a payphone on Highway 3 just a short distance past the gate that everybody used to call parents back home, and that was all that was in Sebastian's mind at that moment. Guns was running as hard as she could with her lungs on fire and her arms and legs all rubbery, and almost didn't recognize Melissa with her purple hair when she ran into a handful of the junior counselors crouching in the trees. Guns saw what they were seeing, which was a bunch of flaming arrows hitting the side of the senior girl's cabin while her friends screamed inside. The juniors had screens only, but the senior counselors had glass windows and box fans. But tonight, that was the worst possible thing. So Guns grabbed a big chunk of wood off the ground and ran across the open stretch between the trees and the cabin and threw that log right through the window. She reached through and grabbed for Tammy, who was standing right there, frozen with her big cow eyes, and Guns knew she was never going to be able to pass the babysitter test no matter how much she studied. Melissa shouted, "Guns!" from right behind her, which surprised her that the younger counselor had followed her up there. She turned and saw Mr. Little coming around the corner of the cabin, drawn by the sound of smashing glass. He had a bow and arrow over his shoulder and a gun in his hand. The first shot went wide and knocked Tammy back from the window. The second lifted Melissa off her feet and into the darkness. Then Guns saw the black eye of the pistol, looking right at her. Sebastian climbed over the gate when he couldn't work the latch and fell on the dirt on the other side. Now he really was crawling, trailing blood, the light from the glass box with the frosted Indiana Bell logo on the side dead ahead. Sebastian heard before he saw the giant front end of a Chrysler Newport grumbling down the highway. The big car slowed and stopped, and Sebastian felt a flood of relief wash over his jangling nerves. An old woman peered out of the passenger window. "It's a colored boy. Keep driving, Jasper." And the Newport kicked up dirt and was gone. Of all the nights, thought Sebastian, and kept crawling. It wasn't much farther. He worked the glass door of the booth and fumbled the receiver while half steadying himself by the cord. He had heard you didn't need a dime if you were calling the cops, but he'd never tested it. It turned out to be true.
"Operator."
"I'm at Camp Elderberry."
"That old place is still open?"
"Yes, ma'am. It's on fire, and somebody is shooting the place up."
"Is this a practical joke, son?"
"No, ma'am, it's real. We need cops and firemen and a couple of ambulances."
"Calling the police is not a joke."
"My brother, I don't know." Sebastian was really woozy now.
"Have you been drinking, son?"
"Just peach Faygo." Sebastian dropped the phone and slumped to the floor of the booth. Guns heard a click in the darkness. Mr. Little very calmly reached into his pocket and started rummaging around, and Guns knew he was just casually reloading like she wasn't standing there. So she got pissed and picked a ragged shard of glass off of the ground and ran for him, swinging. When she saw the arc of bright crimson against the moonlight, she knew Mr. Little recognized she was there after all. The glass cut her palm, but cut Mr. Little worse, and he sat down hard on the ground with blood coursing out of his throat, and Guns actually sat down next to him, because she was pretty tired herself. Neither Sebastian nor Guns heard the sirens coming from way far off. A couple of hours later, and Guns was watching the camp burn. The VFD were sort of controlling it rather than stopping it, but had heard the camp was probably going to close next year anyway, and at least now the owners could get some insurance off of it. Guns and Sebastian were alive, and Melissa was pretty much alive, and Keys was a little bit alive, but many others were completely dead, including, thankfully, Mr. Little. Guns was sitting on the hood of an AMC Matador Enforcer that belonged to the county sheriff, trying to take it all in. The sheriff offered her a lucky strike, which was her grandpa's brand, but she was out of options. "Did you ever go into his old shed?" the sheriff asked. "God, no, nobody did." "So, you didn't know he was Biff Carter?" "No, sir. His name was Mr. Little. That was his real name. He wrote paperbacks under the name Biff Carter. Those books about the castigator. His shelves were full of them." Guns vaguely remembered her dad had some of those around too. "Isn't the character a Vietnam veteran like Mr. Little?" "Yeah. Then he comes back and fights the mafia for a couple of books, then goes after whoever else is around after that. Black Panthers, hippies, whatever. But Little was never a Vietnam veteran." "He always said..." Guns trailed off. The sheriff blew smoke and pointed at his temple. "There was a sheet in the typewriter. The publisher wanted a new Biff Carter. He was getting fired off of his own creation. Guess it was, too much for him, especially on a hot night like this." Guns nodded, but wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking she was glad Keys was alive, but it was one thing to have a mixed boyfriend over the summer, and another to have one during the school year. But she had saved his life, probably, and that meant something. Maybe she would bring him to homecoming anyway. But they wouldn't go to the bonfire. She was going to be sick of hot nights and fires and such for a very long time. Well, my friends, we've had ghosts seeking revenge and maniacs hunting us for sport. So now, how about we go in a more beastly direction. With this terror tale from David O'Hanlon, a regular weekly spooky contributor and the writer of 4 Babysitter Massacre books available now on Amazon Kindle and Audible. Just search Babysitter Massacre if you like a little splatter with your terror. But now, my friends, it's time for us to head to Fagin County, where they have quite the wolf problem. We'll see how that goes and more after these quick words from our sponsors.
The Wolf of Fagin County by David O'Hanlon.
Maybe Whistler was a nice town once. It seemed that way until the summer of '86. The old folks always whispered about certain places, about the places you don't go and the boogeymen that dwelled within. Everyone in Fagin County knew a local ghost story. Back then, I loved to hear those stories. Nowadays, not so much. My dad trucked crops from the farms into the neighboring states of Louisiana and Mississippi. I didn't see much of him. He left before dawn and got home after sunset. The day before my 13th birthday, he took a load to Shreveport. I awoke to a stack of used horror comics the next morning with a note that read, "You're old enough for the good ones now, soldier." I loved the way those pages smelled. After all these years, I still have a couple of them in the suitcases I live out of. I'd read through the entire bundle in a week. I flipped through them and found the one I'd enjoy the most for a second visit when my mother called from downstairs. "Connie, come quick!" she shouted. I hated when she called me that. It was bad enough being named Conrad. The effeminate nickname caught on with my friends in second grade, and then with the rest of the student body by the end of recess. Something sounded off in her voice as I trudged down the narrow staircase that descended into the kitchen. Mom was sitting at the table with her elbows pressing into the vinyl top, and her hands hiding her face. My sister, Lisa, had her head down, shrouded in her arms. Her body convulsed as she bawled noisily inside. I held my breath all the way to the table. No one spoke to me as I slid the chair away from the edge and eased my way into it. Mom reached over and put her hand on mine. "Something terrible's happened," she whispered. Something terrible had happened a few weeks ago, too, and a few weeks before that. We'd discussed both of those events as a family. No one was crying then. Sure, Mom had been shaken up by the discovery of the first body, but it seemed like nothing to worry about. We all knew Old Man McGarrah from around town. He would pop out like a magician's rabbit to grump about what a bunch of slack-jawed hippie spawn all the kids were whenever you least expected it. The police said it was a heart attack that took him, and that coyotes took to eating his remains. Grotesque and unseemly as it were, my folks delivered the news to my sister and me with just the facts and reminded us to stay away from the woods. Coyotes rarely attacked people, but Dad said there's something different about any animal, including man, once they got a taste for blood. The second time we were called to the table, it was clearly more bothersome. Mom wasn't handling it well, but she remained calm as she told us about the bodies found along Country Road 63. A couple of teens gone to make out got cut up real bad. Chief Hardesty said it was just a freak occurrence, a crime of opportunity, and that the killer was likely long gone. Our parents told us to be home 30 minutes before sundown after that, and to never go anywhere alone, just in case. This time was different. "Connie," she started, tugging at the silver locket dangling from her thin neck. Her voice trembled. "It's Brenda." My stomach nodded. Brenda Knowles had been Lisa's best friend since kindergarten. She'd babysat for me on a few occasions and came to eat dinner with us every Wednesday. She was my first crush, too. I sniffled, but held back any other reaction until Mom could finish. Maybe it wasn't what I thought. Maybe those old Tales from the Crypt comics were poisoning my imagination the way Father Dean said they would at youth service. Maybe she was just moving away. That would explain why they were so upset. Chief Hardesty found her this morning, Mom continued. Nope, it was exactly what I thought it was. I don't remember the exact moment that I realized the killings were exactly 1 month apart, but I do remember Lisa raising her face to stare at Mom and then me in turn. Her lips quivered, and then she stood up fast enough to knock the chair to the floor. She slammed her fists onto the table and screamed. That I'll never forget. That look. And those words. She was eaten. Lisa cried until she passed out that night. I watched the news with Mom to see if the police had anything to say. The station's newest reporter, Rex Willits, looked like he'd been sick as he raised the microphone close to his chin. His hand shook slightly and his trademark smile was nothing but a thin line of white teeth below his bushy mustache. Rex nodded slowly and started his report when the phone rang in the kitchen, and Mom went to answer. I'm here at the Ridley Funeral Home in Fagin County to report on a grisly, unimaginable crime, Rex started. He swallowed hard. The body of 15-year-old Brenda Knowles was found just before dawn this morning. Brenda had been babysitting for family friends the prior evening. She started the short walk to her home just before 11 p.m. I turned my attention to Mom's shouting in the kitchen. What do you mean 2 days, Paul? She growled. It doesn't take 2 damn days to get a mechanic. Dad's truck broke down. That happened a lot when he was hauling rice to Shreveport. Only then, though. Mom noticed too. She had a pretty good idea of what was going on. What about the kids? She wailed. You know what's going on here. You're leaving us alone so you... Her voice became muffled and I scooted closer to the television to hear what Rex had to say. I heard the phone slam against the receiver several times and Mom stomping up the steps. I've seen the body. My God in heaven, I'll never unsee it now, Rex said when movement caught his attention. He snapped his fingers and pointed his cameraman in the direction of the police chief. Other reporters rushed in around him. Rex elbowed one of them out of his way and reached in with his mic. Don't you buzzards have anything better to do? Chief Hardesty barked. A child's dead, for Christ's sake. How? Rex asked. How did she die? Violently, Hardesty answered in his low, gruff drawl. Is this related to last month's double homicide? A woman asked. We don't have conclusive evidence linking the two this early in the investigation, Hardesty said. His shoulders sagged. There are similarities. Were the other victims missing flesh and muscle? Rex quizzed him. Were there bite marks on them as well? Hardesty glared at Rex, and then spoke with forced restraint. At this time, I'm asking all residents of Whistler and the outlying areas to stay indoors at night. The curfew is merely a request, however. The wail of sirens cut the report short. We wouldn't find out until the morning that they'd found another body. Crazy Dolores lived in a shack on the edge of town. She sold herbal remedies and told fortunes for $1. No one knew how long she'd been dead. I climbed into bed, but didn't dare go to sleep. I opened a comic and thought about Dad. Maybe the rig really broke down, but I didn't buy it. He was spending time with some woman, in a strange way that made me feel better. He was more worried about getting laid than he was about the killer on the loose, so maybe it wasn't a big deal. My door creaked open, and Lisa slipped through the gap. I laid the comic down. I didn't know what to say. Sorry your friend was brutally murdered and partially eaten really didn't seem like it helped the situation. Then again, we're going to find Brenda's killers wasn't a winner either, but that's exactly what Lisa said as she leaned on my dresser. I gawked at her and waited for what felt like an eternity for her to say something else. Look, Connie, she started, then paused and chewed her bottom lip. Chief Hardesty is a scumbag. He's going to pin all this on the first person that ain't Baptist enough for him. Then the murderer is just going to drift away. I was still too young to know how common that sort of thing was around there, or what kind of man Baxter Hardesty really was. I did want to make sure that Brenda's killer got caught, however. The killings are about a month apart, I said, hesitantly, unsure of exactly what I'd discovered. I shrugged. What if the killer travels and just stops through here every few weeks? Or lives here and returns home once a month? Lisa offered. Dad's friend Ted is a long-haul driver. I remembered. Ted tried to convince Dad to work with him all the time. I also remembered Ted coming to my birthday party. I shook my head. I'm pretty sure he's out of town right now. I scratched the 2 recently sprouted hairs on my chin. What about a delivery driver? Brown's only gets a few deliveries a month. Lisa thought it over and nodded. Okay, we'll go by and see when they got a delivery. Thinking the conversation was done, I lifted my comic. What is that, Connie? Lisa asked shakily. What are you reading? I closed the issue and looked down at the cover. Bright yellow eyes stared up at me above the fangs, dripping blood over a broken skull. I looked up at my sister. I knew what she was thinking, and I wanted to tell her that she was stupid. I wanted to. But I didn't. The same thought hit me when I looked at those fierce yellow orbs on the black cover. My stomach pitched as I thought about the recent events. My eyes left the stare of the beast and met my sister's. It's a werewolf, I finally said. We tried to put the notion back into our imaginations where werewolves were supposed to stay. Lisa and I rode our bikes to Brown's General Store just past noon. The curfew officially started at sundown and was no longer a request. Not that it mattered, the streets were already deserted. The baseball cards sputtering in the bike spokes signaled the arrival of Brad Breaker. Brad was between Lisa and myself in age, so he hung out with both of us. He was the definition of cool with his acid-wash jeans and his torn midriff Bruce Springsteen t-shirt. Brad could play guitar. And football. He was also muscular, with aquiline features and sandy blonde hair that made him look like Patrick Swayze in Red Dawn, and made Lisa's brain stop working. My mom spazzed when I said I was leaving. Brad looked at the grocery store and turned back to us. But you said it was an emergency. You won't get in trouble, will you? Nah, Brad shrugged. My old man said experience builds character, and that I needed to bring back more Folgers. Lucky this is our first stop, I said. So why are we here? Lisa looked to me. Telling him our theory would have been the right thing to do, but she thought he was cute and hoped I, being closer to the childish age to believe such things, would do it for her. I did not. We want to find Brenda's killer, I said and waved at the street. Everyone's scared to death, but we want to help. Why? Brad asked. I mean, why do you think you can do it faster than the police? I removed the wrinkled, somewhat neatly folded newspaper clippings and handed them to him. Mr. Megara died and his corpse was eaten by coyotes. That's what they say anyhow. There's been a killing at the same time every month since. Each of those victims was partially eaten as well, I said, rattling off the facts as quickly as I could. I think the killer comes to town once a month. We think the murderer might be a delivery person or a truck driver, so we want to ask the Browns if they've gotten any shipments this week, Lisa added. Gnarly, Brad nodded slowly. Let's get to work. The Browns deliveries turned up bupkis. We checked with every business in town for the same results. That theory was as dead as Brenda, which left us with only one other possibility. 7:15, we stopped by the ice cream shop and got sundaes for a quick sugar rush before dinner. I debated sharing the werewolf idea. I'd been trying to dismantle it as we asked around. If it was a werewolf, why'd the killings start only recently? Was anyone acting differently around town? Was anyone new? What made someone a werewolf? So many questions, but none of them ruled out the possibility. What if... It's stupid, Brad said, staring up at the now full moon. What if it's a werewolf? Lisa choked and stared at me, wide-eyed over puffed cheeks full of banana split. I mean, my pops tells me to stay away from Snyder Creek because some kids died back in the 1920s. Everyone says that was a monster. Why couldn't this be one? Darn it! I snapped my fingers and scooted my chair back with a screech of steel feet against the sidewalk. Why didn't I think of that? Think of what? Lisa asked. I've heard that story too, I answered. The Snyder Creek Ghoul. They never found out what really happened. Lisa, we need to go to the library and see if we can find any old papers about it. Not a chance, Connie. She pointed at the Sherbert skyline. We need to get home before dark. It's a long ride. The library's probably already closed anyway, Brad offered. The cops are never going to believe us, Lisa said. After tonight, he'll just be a man, I reassured her. We'll have a month to find out who the werewolf is and prove it. Crap! Brad let his head hang, most non-triumphant. What? Lisa and I asked in unison. I forgot the coffee. He put a foot on a pedal. I'm going to hustle to Brown's. See you later. He wouldn't. Brad's body wasn't found for 6 days. Worst of all, strange as it sounds to say it like a bad thing, he didn't get eaten. It would be a while before Lisa drew a startling conclusion from the fact. The curfew started an hour earlier after that. A citizens' patrol was organized as well. It wasn't much more than a dozen yokels with spotlights and guns driving the paved roads, however. They wouldn't go down the miles of gravel paths, where there weren't any streetlights to keep them safe. They didn't find the werewolf either. All they accomplished was shooting a drifter who was busking at the Crispy Chicken truck stop. Chief Hardesty tried to pin the murders on that poor soul like Lisa had suspected he would. No one was buying it. By that point, Dad had decided that between the new woman and a monster running roughshod back home, he had all the reason he needed to move to Louisiana. He came while we were asleep to collect his things. We spent every day tracking down information and investigating whatever absurd idea came to us. It was 2 nights before the next full moon when Lisa told me her troublesome theory. He didn't eat Brad because he was warning us, she said somberly across the table. The local library had few books on lycanthropy. We'd been reading them every night and comparing them to the 2 clippings we had from 1926, when the Snyder Creek Ghoul had struck. I put the piece of paper I was using as a bookmark between the pages of the tome and closed it. What do you mean? I whispered. We were asking around about delivery schedules, about people from out of town. She shook her head. The wolf isn't a stranger. We know him. And he heard us talking. He wants us to leave him alone. I checked my watch and reached under the table, wrestling with the zipper from my fanny pack. Then he shouldn't have killed our friends, I growled. I pulled my prize and set it where Lisa could see with a heavy thump. Her eyes widened at the sight of cold blue steel. Dad forgot it when he packed, I told her, and lifted the St. Christopher medallion our aunt had given me for my birthday. I've got this and $6 silver. We can make 2 or 3 bullets with that. We don't know how to make bullets. Otto Dickens does, I pointed out. We have time to get to his store and back home if we go right now. We're not hunting this damn thing, Connie. Lisa stood quickly and looked around at the mostly empty library. She lowered her voice. We should stop this. If he killed Brad to scare us off, then he knows who we are. We need the bullets regardless. Her face twisted with contempt. She knew I was right and scooped her backpack before heading to the exit. We rode our bikes to the fork in the road, left to our house or right to Otto Dickens' gun shop. Lisa didn't speak as she leaned and pulled her Schwinn down the right-hand street. I smiled softly and followed. Most families in Whistler had lived no further away than the county line for generations. Otto just seemed to appear one day. Despite what you might have heard about Southern hospitality, it doesn't apply to strangers. Otto had an uncanny ability with firearms, however. Small towns of rural Arkansas might have hated strangers, but they certainly loved their guns. Otto was soon a welcomed member of the community and set up a shop on the far side of town, a couple of miles past the old cemetery. The tarnished bell over the door announced our arrival with whatever the hell a bell's version of a smoker's cough is. Otto looked up from the reloading station, his face twisted with curiosity as two teens entered his tiny store. A long scar parted his wild white beard on the left side of his face. He held up the cartridge he was working on between his thumb and index finger. "Best goddamn rifle round in history," he said in a voice that sent a shiver racing up my spine. 45-70. I kept a chopped-down Winchester in this caliber for clearing tunnels. Can't hear much of shit anymore as a result, but it could turn old Victor Charlie inside out in those confined spaces. You ever shot a man? Lisa and I exchanged bewildered glances. How many kids could say yes? Didn't think so. Otto deposited the finished cartridge into a cardboard box beside him. Well, what can I help you with then? Too early for hunting. Not what we're hunting, I said. Lisa elbowed me in the ribs and cleared her throat. You can make bullets, right? Reckon I can. Lisa held out her hand and I gave her the items from my fanny pack. Otto left his stool and prowled to her. He bounced the coins and pendant in his palm. His amber eyes darted from one of us to the other before he snorted. You want silver bullets. He set the materials on his counter and shook his head. That's a shit idea. Silver's too dense. It won't take the rifling. Unless you plan on shooting at a barn, you won't be hitting nothing from more than a few feet. Muzzle velocity with nosedive too, because the round is heavier than your powder load. You won't mushroom either. They'll go clean in and clean out. Shot shells. That's what you need if you're looking to use silver. Lisa looked at me, completely lost in the gunsmith's lesson in ballistic science. I didn't understand it either. We don't have a shotgun, I finally said. We have a Chief Special 38. A snub nose, shooting silver bullets. Otto burst with boisterous laughter. Hell, you kids might as well slather yourselves in barbecue sauce and yell, "Here, puppy!" if you plan on fighting a werewolf with that setup. My jaw fell open, and I quickly glanced to my sister to find her in the same state. Otto put a hand on each of our shoulders. I hadn't noticed before, but 3 of his fingers were missing from the one resting on me. He hunkered slightly to look us in the eyes. Don't look surprised. Ain't much else you could be doing with silver bullets. He went behind the counter and pulled a sawed-off shotgun from beneath the register. My eyes drifted to the black tape wrapped around the walnut stock and the rough scratches where a serial number had once been. Reckon you can borrow this one. Going to take about an hour on the shells. You believe us? I asked. Lots of things in this world we pretend not to believe in no more. Pretend weren't real in the first place. He absently rubbed the scar on his cheek with the nubs of his fingers. We pretend until they start eating us. The sun was just an orange razor's slash by the time we got home. We dropped our bikes in the yard and ran inside. The shotgun mostly fit inside Lisa's backpack so we could sneak it past Mom. Not that it mattered. All the lights were off and she wasn't waiting for us like normal. I headed for the living room while she stashed the gun and changed clothes. How are you, soldier? A gruff, ragged voice asked from a darkened corner. The hairs prickled on the back of my neck at my dad's pet name for me. He stepped out of the shadows. He looked different and naked as he gracefully scaled the back of the couch and perched on the cushion. The weak glow of the mail-order torch lamps shimmered on the sweat-slick hairs growing longer from his tight flesh. His elongated nails scratched at the thick orange fabric of the sofa. You can catch a lot from whores, he said. He spoke slowly, like each word was new to him. Long strands of drool slung from his mouth as he flexed his jaw with a series of loud, painful pops. Your ma knew. Tried to fix it with crazy Dolores. His obsidian eyes focused on the coffee table. I saw Mom's locket sitting there next to the half-full ashtray, still wet with blood. "It's not just the bite," he grumbled, his words becoming deeper and more human. "It's like the clap. I brought it home. Made her. Mr. Megara was... accident." He shifted on the cushion. Things moved inside his body, bones and muscles realigning, and he whined like a dog in a sticker bush. He sprang over the table and landed inches from me. His nose twitched as he took in my scent. His lips didn't touch anymore as the fangs locked together. Stiff fur covered his once chubby cheeks. "She couldn't control," he growled. His teeth snapped in front of me.
"I can. Join. Pack. Become. Come with me, soldier."
I quivered with fear, with hurt, with anger. I never suspected my parents. I needed answers. Lisa screamed and broke me out of his hypnotic gaze. His hand clamped over my mouth. He watched the stairs, waiting for Lisa to come down. I eased my hand to the fanny pack, wiggling my fingers to stretch the zipper without the noise. "Connie?" Lisa called. Dad sniffed the air. I watched his pointed ear twitch. He whipped his head back around to me and his eyes widened as the barrel pressed against his chest. The .38 was louder than I remembered. The bullets weren't silver, but they did the trick. He fell backwards and crashed through the table. I fired the rest of them into his face while he was down. He screamed in pain behind me while I darted for the stairs. I slammed into Lisa, who was clutching the shotgun. "I think there's 2 of them!" I wasn't listening. I jerked the weapon from her hands and went to finish Dad off. Only, he wasn't there. 2 bloody bullets rolled in the debris of the coffee table. A shadow fell over me from the kitchen. I threw myself to the floor, narrowly dodging the swipe of my father's claws. I rolled onto my back, and he looked more monstrous than before. His face had contorted into a snout. The front window shattered, startling me. My finger tensed on the trigger, and the silver buckshot tore through Dad's thigh, obliterating the wood paneling beyond. I clambered up the stairs and Lisa pulled me to my feet by my collar. We ran into our parents' bedroom and slammed the door behind us. I screamed when I saw the body on the bed. It was Mom, but just barely. Her features were still deformed, her body still covered in the bristly fur of her new form, and her head hung from the gnawed throat by a few remaining strands of muscle. Everything Dad tried to tell me suddenly made sense. His new girlfriend turned him, and he turned Mom. That's how the werewolf knew we were snooping. Mom was doing the killing, while Dad joined his new pack in Louisiana. I vomited at the foot of the bed. "What's happening?" Lisa asked. Downstairs sounded like a dogfight. Snarls, yips of pain, furious barks, things breaking. I threw the door open and whipped around the corner with the shotgun raised and ready. Dad pounced onto the stairs. Blood gushed from wounds and he bared his fangs as he crawled up the steps toward me. I pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. I remembered duck hunting with him, and then my own folly. I hadn't chambered another round. He drew closer as I racked the slide, but it was too late. His claws opened deep furrows in my thigh and I toppled backwards. Then the other wolf came into view. It grabbed my father's legs and pulled him down the steps before mounting his back. The beast howled victoriously and glared at me with amber eyes set in white fur. The monster clamped its fully formed jaws down on the back of Dad's neck. I heard the wet snap of the spine as it shook its head from side to side. I stared at the long scar, parting its fur, at the claws digging into its prey, and the missing fingers beside them. I pressed the barrel of the shotgun to the back of my father's skull and fired. The white wolf slunk away. Brain matter and pieces of skull clung to its fur. I pumped the shotgun again. And then, the beast was gone. By morning, the bodies had fully reverted to their human forms. Chief Hardesty didn't question anything. Dad was the killer, and Mom was just a victim. We let him run with that story. Before our aunt could come and pick us up, we needed to take care of one more thing. We rode our bikes to Otto Dickens' shop and found him assembling a pistol at his counter. "Reckon the police seized that gun," he said simply. "Yeah," I answered. "Sorry, I guess." I set my mother's locket on the counter and looked at the gunsmith questioningly. "Wolfsbane," he licked his lips. "It helps when you're young, when the moon is still your master." He finished the pistol he was working on and slipped it into a messenger bag. He pushed the kit over to me. "I haven't killed anyone in a long time, in case you were wondering," he told us. "What do we do now?" Lisa asked. "Different breeds of wolf the world over. My kind don't have a pack here." He pointed at the gauze around my leg. "Your old man's kind does. You took from them. They'll take from you. A wolf never forgets. You're just rabbits now, and there's nothing left to do for a scared bunny. But to run." We took the bag Otto prepared for us and left his shop. We didn't go back to the house and wait for our aunt, though. We rode our bikes to the outskirts of Fagin County and hitched a ride at the Crispy Chicken. They caught up with us in St. Louis 3 years later. I buried Lisa behind a city park. I rest in one place until I hear the bays of the pack on those bright, moonlit nights, and then I disappear onto another stretch of asphalt, always moving, always staying ahead of the wolves, always ready to remind them that rabbits have teeth too.
All right. After having that hair-raising terror thrown at us, maybe it's time to get away from it all. Oh no, not any more camping, that's for sure. In fact, let's just write off all kinds of Americana travel and recreation. Yeah, let's get away from that. How about instead we go on a nice, long road trip? Yeah, to some faraway place where things couldn't possibly go wrong. Or maybe they're already very, very wrong, because this story is from Keith Tomlin, one of my favorite contributors and good friends to the show, and it's called Bed and Breakfast and Zombies. So remember, this is the most important meal of your day, and we'll get to it after this.
Bed, Breakfast, and Zombies by Keith Tomlin. Jake sighed loudly as he stared out the second-story window of the bed and breakfast that he and his father had been staying at for the last few days. "This sucks," he thought. "I should have gone to Grandpa's with Mom." His family was on a rare vacation, taking a trip from Chicago to New York City to visit his mom's parents. It was the four of them: Jake, his little sister Sarah, his father Edward, and his mother Karen, all jammed into a 12-year-old Volvo wagon. Jake remembered when his father, during breakfast a few days ago, could barely contain his excitement. "Kids, I was looking over my papers last night," he said, pointing to a huge stack of papers that he pored over every moment that he wasn't driving. "And I found something exciting." He looked wide-eyed at both of his children. Sarah was using all of her concentration to draw on a coloring page that doubled as the kids' menu, so Edward focused on his 11-year-old son. "Jake, how would you like to look for some witches?" Jake was swept away with his dad's excitement. They dropped the others off at his grandfather's house and jumped back on the road to a small town in New York called Stones Creek. Jake wondered what they needed to hunt witches. Do we need garlic or maybe silver bullets? What Jake didn't know, and soon found out, was the only things they needed was the local library and long walks in an old graveyard across the street from the Grinning Cat Inn, the bed and breakfast at which they would be staying. Jake was bored. He sighed, louder this time.
I heard you the first time, his dad said, without looking up from the papers he copied from the library. When he finished the page, he finally looked at Jake, removing his unlit pipe from his mouth, and pointed at Jake with it. "Why don't you go outside and play?" he said, gesturing to the door with his pipe. "But Dad, I'm bored," Jake said, his shoulders slumping forward. "Look, once I get through these pages, we can take a walk. You can either go outside and play until then, or sit there quietly and read a book." His dad gave him one last stern look before turning his attention back to his stack of papers. Read a book, Jake thought. Why is it always books with him? Jake didn't want books. He wanted fun and adventure. Suppressing another sigh, he turned his attention back to the window. He was surprised to see a car on the road. He had only seen one other car all day. He was even more surprised and excited to see that the car started to slow down. "Dad, Dad, Dad," Jake said quickly, as he had always done when he grew excited. "There's a car turning into the parking lot." "Really? That's interesting," his dad mumbled. Jake watched intently as the car glided to a stop in front of the inn. The driver, a huge, bulky man, got out and opened the rear door. A well-dressed man stepped out of the back seat of the car, quickly followed by a young boy who looked around Jake's age. "Dad, Dad, Dad, Dad," Jake said, getting louder with each word. "They have a kid. Can I go down and meet him? Come on, Dad, can I?" Jack started jumping back and forth from one foot to the other. "Okay, hang on," his dad said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "All right, I guess I'm done here for now. I don't want you scaring the poor child with your enthusiasm." Edward set the stack of papers aside. "Let's go downstairs and greet the new arrivals." The door to the Grinning Cat Inn flew open, and the large man entered. He scanned the room before stepping aside, allowing the well-dressed man to enter. The reception room was lined with cedar panels and had a counter that ran along one wall. A large staircase leading up was right across from the front door. Two other doorways led to a dining room and a large den with a roaring fire in the fireplace. Upon hearing the door, the owner of the inn, Mr. Jarvison, a tall, thin, elderly man, moved to the counter. "Good evening. How may I help you?" asked Mr. Jarvison. The well-dressed man walked over to the counter and, with a thick Slavic accent, said, "I am Count Dmitri Romanova. I have reservation for 2 rooms." "Yes, of course. Your rooms are ready, Mr. How should I address you?" Mr. Jarvison asked. "Please, you may call me Count Romanova," said the Count. "The title is largely symbolic at this point, but," he shrugged, "we do have our protocols." "Yes, sir. I will show you to your rooms," Mr. Jarvison said, half bowing. Count Romanova waved him off. "Ivan, my manservant, will look to the rooms and luggage. I wish to relax by the fire," he said, pointing towards the den. He then looked at Ivan, who nodded and gestured to Mr. Jarvison to lead the way up the stairs. The Count turned towards the door and called out, "Come, Nikolai! Let's rest before dinner." A small-framed child around 10 years old entered the inn. He silently followed his father into the den. Edward and Jake had to press themselves against the wall to allow Ivan to pass them on the stairway. Jake stared at the large man, shocked at the sheer size of him. Ivan stopped and turned, glaring at Jake, who quickly turned and ran to catch up with his father. 20 minutes later, Jake was standing outside with Nikolai, trying to find a way to end the awkward silence that hung over them. It took his dad a few minutes to convince the Count to allow his son outside to play, and now Jake was wishing that his father had failed. "So, Jake said, do you like to play ball?" "Sorry, I do not know this game. Ball," Nikolai replied in broken English. "No, ball is not a game. Well, it's part of a game." Jake thought that over for a few seconds. "Never mind. Do you want to play hide and seek?" Jake said, hopefully. "Hide and seek. What do we hide?" Nikolai asked. "No," Jake said, frustrated. "You go hide and I try to find you." Nikolai asked, "We are to be friends, correct?" Jake nodded. "Then why would I hide from you?" Nikolai asked. "Friends should trust each other and not need to hide." "Huh, I never thought of it that way," Jake said. Okay, well, we could... Jake was stumped. He racked his brain for something to do, and his face lit up when he finally thought of something that no kid could possibly resist. Do you want to see something scary? Jake teased, with a big grin. The young foreign boy nodded, slowly. Edward leaned forward over the overstuffed chair, tapping his pipe on the stone of the fireplace and sweeping the ashes into the fire. What brings you to this little corner of nowhere, Count? Edward asked, leaning back and refilling his pipe. He looked apologetically at Mr. Jarvison. Sorry, no offense. None taken. This is a small town. Very small, Mr. Jarvison agreed. The Count took another puff on his cigar and slowly let the smoke escape his mouth. I came to America on a diplomatic trip, but I wanted to take some time to visit the relatives. Mr. Jarvison sat up, beaming. You have relations living here? Count Romanov slowly shook his head. Living? No. Sorry, I used the wrong word. I have... He waved his hand in the air, causing ash to fall onto the arm of his chair. Ancestors here, in cemetery. He pointed toward the graveyard. Jake led Nikolai across the street and into the old graveyard. They walked through the old gravestones, many of which were so weathered that you couldn't read the words engraved upon them. Jake spent many hours here the last few days walking the overgrown paths between the graves with his father. This place held little interest for Jake except for an ancient crypt that they were now approaching. It was a small stone building with vines growing up the walls toward the tiled roof. The most striking feature of this building was that along each wall there were a pair of statues that looked like they were emerging out of the stone surface. Each statue was of a creature with a bald head, pointy ears, and a mouth with razor-sharp teeth. His dad said they were ghouls, undead creatures that feast on the flesh of the living. What do you think? Jake asked as they approached the crypt. He snuck a sideways glance, hoping to have scared the other boy, but instead, he looked amazed. The smaller boy slowly walked around the building, admiring each statue in turn. He then walked along each wall, running his hand along the stone surface as he went. Nikolai turned to Jake and asked, Where is the door? Yeah, my dad wondered the same thing. Weird, huh? Jake replied. Nikolai continued to walk around the building, examining each wall as he went. He finally stopped and waved at Jake, pointing at a brick in the wall. Jake walked over and bent close to discover that there were drawings etched into this brick. Drawings his dad would have called runes. The more he looked, the more they seemed to shimmer. He began tracing them with his finger, and he swore he felt them start to grow hot. Jake took a step back to ask Nikolai if he had spotted any other bricks like this, when his head started to buzz. The buzzing turned into a voice, deep inside his head. The voice began whispering 6 words over and over again. 6 words that he did not understand. These words got louder and louder until finally they burst from his lips in a booming voice. Custos secreta predo malum apier ostium. Jake was unable to stop himself from chanting. Custos secreta predo malum apiere ostium. Jake heard a low hum coming from the wall in front of him. Custos secreta predo malum apiere ostium. The runes started to glow brightly. Custos secreta predo malum apiere ostium. Jake's voice roared, and the wall opened. The Count tossed the remains of his cigar into the fireplace and looked over at Edward. What brings you here? Edward leaned forward excitedly, as if he had been waiting to answer that question all evening. Well, in my day job, I'm a history professor at the University of Chicago, but my real passion is writing about the occult, magic, and the supernatural. He took a puff off of his pipe and continued. I was researching the Salem witch trials, trying to see if I could bring anything new to the table, when I uncovered a series of correspondence between 2 sisters, both witches. One, sadly, was convicted of witchcraft and perished in Salem. He shook his head. The other one wrote about her coven moving here to help protect witches against persecution. Most intriguing, said the Count. Did they say how they would protect the witches? I haven't found many details on that, Edward said, sounding annoyed, except that it involved the undead. Mr. Jarvison looked around uneasily. The secret door in the crypt's wall swung open, revealing an empty room except for a steep staircase leading down. The air smelled stale and musty, and there was an eerie silence. Jake looked at Nikolai, who stared back, wide-eyed. Both boys started forward, Jake in the lead. The staircase ended in a stone door. Jake pushed against it until the door finally screeched open. The sound reverberated throughout the entire structure, sending chills down Jake's spine. The room it revealed was dark, the light from outside barely penetrating several feet. Jake hesitantly stepped forward, and flames shot around the room as a dozen torches flared to life. They revealed a large, circular room with a dozen stone doors around the perimeter. The floor was made of white marble with black marble inlays, creating a large pentagram. In the center of the pentagram stood an altar with a large leather-bound book sitting atop it. "Wow," Jake exclaimed as he took in the sight. He looked back to check on Nikolai, who was a few steps behind him. Jake slowly moved forward, fascinated by the book. Almost without realizing it, he was standing in front of the altar, staring down at the large tome. He looked back, and Nikolai was standing at the edge of the pentagram, with one foot raised, as if he was trying to decide if he wanted to cross over it or not. Jake turned back and reached out to touch the book. The room exploded in white light, and Jake was blinded as he heard Nikolai cry out in pain. A series of loud thumps shook the ground as the stone doors fell open. He looked up and saw black shapes moving behind each doorway. Jake turned and started to run toward the stairs. Nikolai was on the ground at the edge of the pentagram, withering in pain. As Jake paused to help Nikolai, he glanced around the room. In each of the dozen doorways, a walking corpse emerged, each dressed in filthy, flowing white robes. Their skin was leathery and taut across their faces and hands. As they emerged from the darkness, they raised their hands as if they were searching for something, sniffing almost like dogs. Jake could hear the wet rattles of them inhaling deeply. The creatures didn't look like the ones from the movies, but he knew what they were. Zombies. Jake stood there, paralyzed with fear, until the nearest zombie suddenly caught the scent of something in the air and whipped its head around to stare at the two boys. A rune carved into each of their foreheads began to glow as they opened their mouths and moaned. Jake pulled Nikolai up and pushed him towards the stairs. Without taking another look behind him, he ran. "Are there any of these, witches still around?" the Count asked. "That's what I've been trying to find out. I believe that most of the original settlers were witches. I've been looking at the genealogy records, and, as far as I can tell, the last of their living relatives perished in a fire back in the late 1950s, Edward said somberly. "Yes, that was an awful thing," Mr. Jarvison mused. "My family lived a few counties over when it happened. I was just a young child, but I still remember the news accounts. Very sad. Most of the town was attending some kind of meeting at the town hall when it caught on fire. Very few survived." All three men fell silent. The two children burst from the crypt, sounds of heavy footsteps echoing from the darkness behind them. Jake paused a moment to try to get his bearings. The sun was going down, and he was a bit confused on how to get back to the inn. Nikolai had kept running straight into the overgrown brush that had overtaken this part of the cemetery. Upon hearing footsteps at the top of the stairs behind him, Jake quickly followed. Why did he have to run this way? Jake wondered, as a sticker bush tugged at his clothes. He finally gave a great pull and fell back into a clearing. Getting up, he saw that he was at the stone path that followed the 10-foot-tall stone wall that surrounded the cemetery. Jake recognized some of the tall monuments, and he knew where he was. Jake turned toward the right and ran along the path. After a few minutes of running, Jake heard a scream coming from ahead of him. They must have got Nikolai, Jake thought. He began to run faster. The Count broke the silence suddenly. "Did you hear a noise? Something is not right." The other two men shook their heads, looking around the room. "Ivan," the Count said quietly. The large man stepped forward out of the shadows, quiet as a mouse. "Go check on Nikolai." Ivan nodded and glided off. Something is not right, Count Romanova repeated himself, looking out the window into the growing darkness. Jake ran faster than he'd ever ran in his life. As the path turned toward the entrance, he tripped on a tree root and was sent flying. He hit the ground hard and rolled a few times before landing against a small tree. However, when he looked up, he realized that it wasn't a tree. It was the legs of a large zombie. The undead creature looked down at him and, surprisingly, turned away and shambled on. Jake was stunned, but flew back into action when he heard Nikolai cry out again, this time very close. Jake looked around and saw Nikolai standing at the entrance of the cemetery, in the middle of a ring of 5 zombies. One had grabbed him by the arm and was lifting him up while the others reached out for him, the runes glowing brightly on their forehead. Jake picked up a rotting tree branch for a weapon and started to move to help Nikolai. He stopped when he saw a huge shape come out of the darkness. He sighed with relief when he realized it was Ivan, but the look of murderous rage on the big man's face almost scared him as much as the zombies did. Ivan waded into the middle of the group of zombies with a ferocity that Jake had never seen before. Ivan tossed the zombies aside like they were rag dolls, striking them with thunderous blows that didn't seem to do any real damage to them. When a creature was knocked down, they would rise back up and continue their assault. When 3 more zombies stumbled into view, Ivan pushed the 2 nearest ones down, picked up Nikolai, and ran back toward the inn. Seeing Ivan disappear into the blackness jolted Jake into action, and he ran after them. The door to the inn crashed open and Ivan charged inside, still carrying Nikolai. Ivan's suit was torn and his face and arms were covered with scratches. Jake ran in after them and slammed the door shut, locking it. "Dad! Zombies!" Jake yelled. What?" Edward said, leaping to his feet. Right then, the window behind Edward exploded inward. Undead hands clawed at the windowsill, trying to pull themselves into the room. Another window was smashed and loud thumping shook the front door as the dead tried to break it down. "Oh my, what is going on?" yelled a terrified Mr. Jarvison. Ivan ran to hold the front door as Edward grabbed a lamp and started hitting at the arms reaching into the den. They could hear glass breaking in the other rooms of the house. Mr. Jarvison finally snapped and ran out of the den. He let out a terrified scream as a zombie lurched out of the dining room in the reception area. It ignored Mr. Jarvison as it shambled toward the Count, the rune on its forehead glowing brighter with each step. "The runes!" Edward yelled, pointing at the glowing brand on the zombie's forehead. "Some powerful magic created these things." "Can you stop them?" Jake said, fearing the answer. "Not without knowing the spell used to animate them," Edward yelled back, using the lamp he had to push a zombie off the windowsill. "Jake, the book!" Nikolai yelled, trying to help his father who was struggling with the zombie from the dining room. "Yeah, Dad, there's some kind of spell book or something in that weird crypt in the graveyard," Jake said to his father. "That may be our only chance," Edward shot back. "Count, we need to get to that crypt, now!" he yelled. The Count, who was holding his own against the zombie, yelled out, "Ivan, to me! We need to get to the graveyard!" Ivan rushed over and tossed the zombie attacking the Count aside through a broken window. Just as Ivan turned back to the front door, it burst open and 3 more zombies began to stumble in. Ivan ran and leapt, knocking them back outside. "Go! Go!" yelled Edward as everyone ran toward the front door. The next 10 minutes seemed like a nightmare to Jake. Ivan was an unstoppable tank running through the dark, knocking over any creature in his way. The rest of the group followed in his wake, trying to keep up. Once in the graveyard, Edward pointed the way to the crypt. The small party entered the crypt and ran down the stairs to the large marble room. Edward ran over to the book on the altar. Ivan stood with his back pressed up against the door, waiting for any sign of the undead creatures. The Count and his son stood just off to the side of Ivan, backs to the wall. Something felt off to Jake, but he didn't know what it was. He watched his dad quickly flip through the book, struggling to understand the words on the pages. Jake tried to connect the pieces. There was something he couldn't put together. "Wait, I think I got it," Edward said, almost to himself. He began reading the words from the book in a loud, booming voice. The undead began pounding on the door, and Ivan, muscles bulging, struggled to keep the door shut. The ground began to shake, and a wind started to rip through the chamber. Howls of anger and pain roared from behind the door as the undead intensified their attack. Something finally clicked in Jake's mind. The zombies ignored me and Mr. Jarvison. The runes grew brighter when they got closer to the Count and his son. "Dad, stop! The zombies aren't after us! They're after them!" Jake yelled, pointing at the Count, who looked back at Jake with a wide grin. Edward showed no sign of hearing his son. He kept chanting, and as he chanted, his voice grew even louder, and the tremors became more powerful. When Edward reached the end of the spell, the black marble of the pentagram burst into flames. The pounding on the door ceased as a silence descended over the room. Edward leaned against the altar, exhausted. Ivan opened the door, and only empty robes littered the floor. No sign of the zombies. Jake started to run to his father when the ground began to vibrate. The white marble floor started to crack as clawed hands began digging their way out of the ground. "What?" Jake exclaimed. "More zombies?" "Oh no," the Count remarked. "These are the relatives I spoke of earlier. My ancestors." The Count laughed as he began to change. His face elongated while his teeth grew sharp. His hair disappeared while his ears grew larger and more pointed. He became one of the creatures from the statues on the outside of the crypt. He became a ghoul. Ivan and Nikolai also began to revert to their true selves. "Those meddling witches kept my family imprisoned for hundreds of years. When we discovered them, we took our revenge and burned them all. But we needed someone pure of heart to open the crypt. Someone like your son," said the Count, running his tongue over his razor-sharp teeth. "We also needed another fool to undo the spell of protection and destroy those pesky undead guardians of theirs," he said, gesturing back towards the white robes. "It took a bit of planning, but we were finally able to forge those letters to draw you here." Dozens of ghouls were slowly extracting themselves from the ground, their shining eyes looking hungrily at Jake and Edward. "I do hope you will join us for dinner," the Count bellowed, laughing.
Okay, so maybe I told a little tiny fib, and that is that we were done with camping. Oh no, I think we need to finish on a big and maybe explosive note as we head back to summer camp, this time courtesy of our good friend David O'Hanlon again. This one is all about summer fun, being a kid, and mad scientists' experiments. And believe me, there's so much more to your summer slaycation. Don't worry, it's even better than that pun. So get comfortable as we wrap up this compilation with one more story of summertime fear. But first, we're going to go to a quick word from our sponsors, and then the fear will begin.
Summer Slaycation by David O'Hanlon. "The plan is simple," Henry Stout said around the butt of his cigarette. "We take the canoes across the lake and into the cypress maze, and then it's just a short hike to the Miniwinian bunkhouses." "What if we get lost?" Lance Calavera snatched the smoke from Henry's mouth. "It's called the maze for a reason." Henry scratched at the patch of bristly hair he called his beard. "I've done the maze 3 times. I can get us through." Henry was on his 4th stay at the Living Grace Rehabilitation Camp for youth offenders. The 13-week camp was developed by Pastor Frank Oppendecker to put kids on the straight and narrow through Christ. If that didn't work, the former Marine Corps drill instructor had more inventive ways to grind the little pukes into productive members of society. The Cypress Maze was the final test for all the teens that entered the program. If they failed, they completed their sentences in a juvenile detention center. It was a one-time deal. Normally, Father O, as the delinquents called him, took a special interest in Henry and brought him back every time he reoffended. He saw Henry as the camp's one and only failure. Henry saw the camp as a grueling but welcomed reprieve from his home, a dilapidated trailer park outside of Russellville called the Green Mile. "Yeah, you've done the maze," Lance said, "but not at night." "Then stay here," Henry threw his hands in the air. Maybe Father O will let you polish the pews for morning service. The rest of us are going to the Mini-Winnions. And then we'll see. Ted Vang cupped both his hands to his chest, as if cradling breasts. Seriously, Ted? Dexter Brown shook his head. With those glasses, you can see them from here. Too many trees in the way. Ted adjusted his glasses over his plump cheeks. Ted's right, Henry smirked. The senior house is responsible for bed checks and lockdown, so they hit the showers last. That's when we'll strike. We throw the bombs through the windows, and they'll all come out running. Dexter held up the Polaroid camera. And I'll get the photos to make sure we all get a good look and don't miss out on anything. What about the counselors? Jimmy O'Reilly, always the pragmatist, asked. They're going to come running too. These babies aren't exactly subtle. Jimmy tossed one of the devices between his hands. It wasn't much bigger than a thermos, with a main body of papier-mâché over chicken wire with 4 thinner cardboard tubes attached to the sides. A waterproof fuse snaked from the top of all 4 and came together in a braid with that of the main device. The entire package was wrapped in black electrical tape for easy concealment on the moonless night. Jimmy's unsettling interest in things that went boom were what landed him in the camp. Spaz'll take care of that, Henry reassured them. Marco Spaz Reynolds tugged at the ends of his shaggy mane and rocked in place, giggling. Yeah, I got something to keep those pesky counselors out of our business. Father O handpicked all the campers. He wanted to challenge himself as much as the youths. Whether it be Henry's seeming inability to rehabilitate, Ted's obesity, Dexter's unwillingness to apply his genius IQ, Jimmy's authority issues, or Lance's temper, each of the 6 teens offered him a chance to prove his faith. Spaz was no different. He grew up in a satanic cult that were currently all facing charges of kidnapping and cannibalism. There was no evidence that Spaz had been involved in the cult's crimes, but it didn't matter. He was still a devout devil worshipper. The raised flesh of a pentagram branded on his forehead made Spaz a poster child for the program, if Father O could reform him. Okay, Lance said, let's stop talking about it and get moving. He grabbed one of Jimmy's devices. No one gets hurt, right? Maybe their feelings, Jimmy shrugged. It's all smoke and sparks and some little pops, just enough to make them think there's a fire. The 6 boys made their way to the door of the cabin, and Dexter poked his head out first. The pastor's cabin was dark in the distance, opposite the oppressive structures of the obstacle course. Dexter nodded the all clear, and they eased through the screen door one after the other, careful not to let the rusted spring slam it shut. The rubber band of Ted's slingshot twanged softly, followed by the unavoidable pop of a light bulb shattering. Jimmy stretched his neck to watch over the bush for Father O's lamp to come on. When it didn't, he tapped Ted's shoulder. The portly Mongolian fired another stone at the second light positioned over the rack of canoes. Shards tinkled off the fiberglass bodies of the little boats. The boys sprinted across the open lot and quickly loosed 3 of the canoes. They carried them overhead just like the pastor made them on their morning marches. The boats hit water, and the teens paddled gently into the lake. On the other side of the lake, the lovely ladies of the Mini-Winnion Girls' Retreat would be working diligently to finish their nightly duties. Then they would head to the showers. Their bare flesh was a siren song sang between the horrid cries of frogs, crickets, and cicadas. The 6 boys increased their rowing without saying a word. They were at the mercy of their loins, which spurred them faster into the low fog that shrouded the mouth of the cypress maze. Spaz held the narrow trunk of a smaller cypress to keep the canoe still as Jimmy urinated over the aft. Henry and Ted shared the lead boat and panned their flashlights around wildly. Lance and Dexter rowed past them and deeper into the maze. "Glad you know the way, Henry," Lance said. "This is the right way," Henry responded. "I marked the trees the last time I went through the stupid thing. We already made it to the second marker, which means the third should be right here. That's the halfway point." "You've been looking for the mark for 20 minutes, Dexter reminded him. "The girls will already be dried off by the time we get there." "They'll still be naked, though," Ted reassured them all. A sudden splash broke up their debate and was immediately followed by a profane cry and another dynamic entrance into the marsh. The 4 teens turned their lights in the direction of the commotion. The red bottom of the canoe was facing up and rocking in the turbulence. The lights danced over the surface of the water and converged on the face-down body that drifted away from the boat, lazily. Oh, damn! Dexter went to work with his oar, rowing them backwards. Hold on, Jimmy, we're coming. The canoe must have come down on him when it flipped. Lance rowed harder and panned his head-mounted light wildly. Where's Spaz? Get him out of the water! Henry twisted in his seat. There's gators out there. Why are we out here in the dark if there's gators? Ted gripped his oar like a spear and gazed at the black void around them. They hunt at night. Lots of things hunt at night. The bank of halogen lights illuminated the teens and everything in a 60-foot path. Dexter pulled Jimmy's unconscious body across the canoe. Behind the glare of the bulbs, a silhouette stalked across the deck of a camouflaged airboat. The form of some strange malevolence moved behind him and slipped over the side, disappearing into the water. Ted stood quickly, swinging the paddle over his shoulder like a club. Who are you? Ted took a step back, rocking the boat hard. Henry leaned forward to the other side to steady them. Get out of here, mister. Our counselor's out here with us. The good pastor is sound asleep, the shadowy figure said. Don't struggle too much. I don't want you hurting yourself. Something broke the surface beside Lance and Dexter. A pair of malformed green-brown appendages reached up and twisted in Jimmy's clothing. His body slipped back into the marsh. Dexter and Lance grabbed his legs and struggled to pull him back in. The tug-of-war intensified with the heavy rocking of the canoe. Jimmy's legs were completely submerged, then up to his ribcage. Suddenly, the boys were airborne. They popped their heads above the filthy water, coughing and rubbing their eyes clear. Jimmy bobbed beside them. They reached for him in unison. They screamed that way, too, when the bisected body of their bunkmate tipped over and sank into the abyss. Dexter watched in horror as Ted and Henry were knocked into the marsh. A net sailed from the airboat over them, and something beneath the surface gathered it, dragging it back to the man hiding behind the lights. Lance disappeared with a quick splash. Dexter swam as hard as he could. He didn't care if he was swimming toward camp or the Mississippi, just so long as he was swimming anywhere that wasn't the cypress maze. Something snagged his shirt. He felt the barbs dragging through his flesh, but forced himself onward. Then, he was underwater. And he wasn't alone. The house sat on a tiny island in the back of the bayou away from prying eyes. Sawgrass obscured the boundaries where land met swamp and the tiny dock at which the airboat rocked sedately. The ramshackle 3-story was built shortly after the Civil War and abandoned for almost as long. Portions of the roof sagged, and others had collapsed long before and were patched with tarps. Glass was long gone from the windows, and the breeze whistled across the edges of the century-old shards that remained. 2 rusted water tanks had been converted to hold gasoline for the generators, and 3 windmills provided the rest of his electricity. The owner stretched his aching limbs. The isolated home was the perfect location for the laboratory and the clandestine aims of his research. It was not so easy on his ailing body, however. He wrung his arthritic hands and worked the blue nitrile gloves over them with a pair of sharp snaps. He checked his reflection in a grimy mirror. Its surface shook with the constant rumbling of the generators. He'd forgotten surgical masks on his last trek into town. Not that it would matter once the procedure was complete. He adjusted the paper cap over the few remaining patches of vomit yellow hair and the unfortunate results of the last treatment. He would succeed soon. It was a shame the one boy was torn in half, but science came with losses. No one cared how many monkeys got vivisected in the name of medical advancement. Teenage boys were just as abundant and equally expendable. One of them was advancing at an exponential rate already. The previous summer's campers were failures, but they did get him closer to his goals, and he was certain that this was his year. He wiggled a tooth in its socket with his tongue. It clacked off the floorboards next to his feet. If he didn't succeed this year, there wouldn't be enough left of him for another harvest. He padded up the stairs, feeling each step rattling his fragile bones. The boy in the suspension tube was showing amazing cellular response. The other had not been so compatible. The doctor watched 2 of his previous failures dragging the corpse to the window to push it over the sill. A splash let him know they'd made their shot. The two creatures slapped each other's backs wildly and screeched with excitement. Baboons were so easily pleased, even ones that weren't entirely monkey anymore. The three remaining teens awaited their first rounds of injections on the reclined gurneys that served as surgical tables. The chubby Asian boy was sobbing while the other two observed the room quietly. The doctor found their calm unsettling and busied himself with turning up the isotope saturation of the suspension tube. The disfigured teen floated in the irradiated solution beneath the glow of ultraviolet lamps that shimmered between the lily pads floating at the top of the tube. The doctor tapped the glass until the boy's eyes opened. "You are a marvelous creature," the doctor said. His two servants bounded closer to him. Leaves pressed through their green-gray hairs with coiling vines dangling from their aged faces like unkempt beards. They were his first successes and his only companions. The doctor patted their heads. "Go feed your siblings. They may not be necessary after tonight." He leaned in and kissed the suspension tube. "We may finally have what we need." Frank Oppendecker dragged the inflatable boat onto the island's shore. His boys were missing, and there were 2 places they could go. With no disturbances at the Mini-Winion camp, that only left the creepy house in the middle of the swamp. Something splashed behind him, and he cocked the shotgun slide to remind the mysterious owner to stay away. It did. Father O crept through the house, thankful for the drone of the generators masking his creaking ascent to the second floor. He pressed the walnut stock of his weapon tight into his shoulder and swiveled around the doorway into the lab. 3 of his campers were strapped down. Another man stood with the back of a filthy lab coat turned toward Father O. He inched into the room, scanning the abundance of shadows left by the inadequate illumination of the strands of Christmas lights overhead. Lance's face stretched into a smile as he saw the pastor coming in to save them. He quickly wiped the look away before the doctor could see it. "Where are the others?" Father O asked. The doctor turned slowly. Warped earthen tendrils stretched from corrupted flesh and wiggled in the air. Beneath the lab coat was nothing but liver spots and deep purple veins broken up by the abominations of the doctor's self-experimentation. Tiny leaves sprang where normal men grew hair, and bright red flowers opened to sniff the air. "You never come to visit anymore, Francis." The doctor ambled closer to Father O with his arms outstretched. "I mean it, Dad. You can't take all of them." Frank lowered his weapon. "I thought your experiments were running amok again. I should have known it was your gluttonous zeal for this blasphemous perversion." "Dad?" Dexter tried to sit up, but the straps binding him to the table just turned it into an awkward twitch. "Father O, what's he talking about?" The pastor ignored him. The doctor pinched the embroidered pocket of his coat and wiggled it in the direction of Dexter. "Dr. Werner Oppendecker. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself sooner." Werner turned to his son. "Does it make life easier, Francis, going through it blindly accepting magic instead of reaching for obtainable knowledge in the realms of science?" "Save me the Thanksgiving disappointment debate, Dad. Cut them loose." He jerked a thumb toward the suspension tube. "You can keep that one, but these 3 are going with me. Where are the other 2? "Dead, I'm afraid. And you're not taking my subjects. I'm too close this time, Francis. I've destroyed my cancers, though with unfortunate side effects. These hooligans that you brought me will take the procedure to a level that will end all human suffering." "Human?" Lance grunted. "Humans don't grow lilies on their skin, you nutjob. You're not human." "And our ancestors were not apes." Werner turned, and the woody tendrils reached out to caress Lance's face. "They were more, and so shall we be. I am no longer just a man." Werner twisted away, letting the appendages scratch Lance's cheeks as he made his way to the tube. He slapped the glass. "Evolution is an undeniable reality, and I have harnessed it. Human and plant will come together to create a human that never ages and is immune to all of our horrible diseases." "Meat and veggies all in one dish?" Dexter said. "Sounds pretty crazy to me. Don't you think so, Ted?" Ted cried louder in response. "I think he agrees," Lance said. "I'm not screwing around, Dad." Father O raised the shotgun to his hip. "I'm taking the boys back with me." "I knew you'd say that," Werner smiled as best he could with so few teeth remaining. You should have paid more attention in school, son. Plants communicate with pheromones. The floor collapsed under him and the shotgun boomed as he fell through. The shrieks of the two baboons mingled with Father O's screams until they were the only sound remaining. Lance stared at the mad scientist clutching the tight cluster of buckshot holes in his abdomen before he toppled over. Werner's face splashed into the pool of water streaming from the holes in the blood-splattered suspension tube. The glass spiderwebbed around them. Fissures raced along the surface until the weight of the fluid tore the pieces away in a fantastic crash of falling glass and rushing water. He struggled to get a hand free of the straps while the mad scientist screamed at the disaster. Success. Lance quickly undid the buckles across his torso and proceeded to free Dexter. They worked in tandem to release Ted, who immediately curled into a fetal position. "I want to wake up, now," he cried. "I'm sorry I tried to look at the girls. I just want to wake up." "We don't have time for this." Lance slapped Ted's cheek with no result aside from a raised handprint. "Come on, Ted. We have to run, now." "Better idea." Dexter kicked the brakes on the gurney's wheels. "That works. Now let's get out of here." They pushed Ted toward the doorway as fast as the rusted, squealing wheels would roll. One of the plant monkeys sprang through the hole in the floor and blocked their path. Its mossy-covered lips peeled away from piercing fangs. Lance slid like he was stealing home base and kicked it back into the hole. The creature's terrified shriek was replaced with Lance's own as gnarled root-like fangs dug into his leg. The second beast emerged from broken floorboards. Tiny buds bloomed among its stiff hairs, revealing snapping floral mouths full of adhesive fuchsia fingers. Even the plant-based parts of the monstrosity hungered for flesh. It launched itself out of the hole and straddled him. The creature tried to pulp Lance's skull and narrowly missed. Dexter seized it by the thick coat of its back, only to be attacked by the miniature mouths hiding there. The plants tore into his hands and held him tight while the baboon's jaws snapped inches from Lance's throat. A horrible, chaotic orchestra of howls, shrieks, and unintelligible shouting played below their battle. "I'm sorry, guys." Ted Vang rolled from his stretcher and darted for the window. "I just wanted to see boobs." The towering green form lumbered across his path. Twisting vines of inching-long thorns hung like living dreadlocks around its verdant face. Scales of bark sprouted along the angular jaw and, in the center of the thing's forehead, was the raised lines of a pentagram. Ted held his arms up defensively. "Spaz? Is that you? It's Ted. We're friends. Right, bud?" "Right," Spaz hissed, before his new hair ensnared the portly camper. Spaz's chest opened with a sticky slurp and he jerked Ted into the maw head first. Spaz snapped around to the remaining campers as they fought with the baboon. He stomped toward the fray. Things just got worse. Dexter slammed a knee into the monkey's tailbone and tore a hand free. Lance held the creature's jaws apart with his face caught between them. "Not from down here, they haven't. Kill this stupid thing!" Spaz's foot connected with Dexter and sent him and the abomination thudding into the wall. "Shit," Lance stared up at Spaz. Things just got worse. Lance rolled away as the thorns scoured the floor in a vain effort to seize him. He pulled the gurney between him and Spaz. Ted's legs kicked soundlessly as his head and torso dissolved inside Spaz's new form. The man-plant's lips contorted in malevolent joy. "I've always enjoyed the taste of human," it growled. "Yeah, well, I've always hated vegetables." Lance grabbed Ted's leg and jumped down the hole. Spaz caught himself on the broken boards and Lance dangled from the leg of his slowly digesting fellow camper. The first floor was a demolition site. The busted cages lined the walls. Malformed freaks ran amok, tearing apart the home and each other. Father O, what was left of him, limped through the madness, freeing more of the doctor's failed experiments. Lance dropped the rest of the distance and picked himself up with a groan. Something that might have been a raccoon snarled at him, and he booted it across the room. Its mossy body bounced next to Father O's shotgun. Spaz came crashing down beside him, with Dexter on his back. The teen winked at Lance, and then jumped off the writhing beast. "Let's get out of here," Dexter said as he ran for the door. "Detour first." Lance dashed for the weapon and joined him on the front porch. They watched some of the creatures swim away from the tiny island. Others simply disappeared beneath the placid surface of the swamp. Lance twisted and saw the oblong, rust-covered tanks next to the house. He raised the shotgun and fired it until it clicked on the empty chamber. Gasoline spurted from the wounds, but the tanks didn't explode. Dexter raised an eyebrow and shrugged. "It's the thought that counts." It always works in the movies, Lance pointed at the airboat. Let's go. The two teens untied from the mooring and turned on the motor, watching the oversized fan spin without any sort of guard. The doctor cared as much for safety as he did for medical ethics, it seemed. Dexter laughed and held up a plastic box with big block letters. Emergency Signal Kit. Lance took the case and opened it quickly. Finding the flare gun inside drew an excited whoop from him. Bet it blows up now, Dexter said. He moved them away from the dock gently as he got the hang of the controls. The boat rocked hard and the boys spun to see Spaz climbing over the side to join them. Dexter jumped from the controls and body-checked him before he could get his balance. The fan blades caught the vines and diced them. Lance and Dexter exchanged glances. Dexter ducked under Spaz's swinging fist and dropped to the deck behind him. Let's toss this salad, Dexter shouted. Lance jumped over the steering column and kicked Spaz with both feet, sending him careening over the prone Dexter and into the fan. Spaz's mulched remains sprayed behind the boat as his body passed through the oversized food processor with ease. Let's toss this salad? That was the best you could come up with? Lance laughed. Dexter scooped the flare gun and slapped it against Lance's palm. Shut up and burn the house down already. Gladly, Lance sat up and fired at the tanks. They watched the fire spread through the tall grass. It moved placidly until it met the dried, ancient timber of the house. The structure flared like a match head, spreading its light across the black water. Somewhere in the swamp, a baboon cried out as it watched its home burn. Think the girls have taken a shower yet? Lance asked. Probably. Dexter turned the steering wheel. Can't hurt to double check. The fuel tanks exploded behind them, but they didn't bother looking back. Dexter sped up, maneuvering through the bayou. The experiments were loose, but at least the doctor wouldn't be making any more. They would tell the authorities what happened. Eventually. There were more pressing matters to attend to first. They smiled through the blood and grime and aimed the boat toward the cypress maze.
Well, my friends, this special compilation has run its course, and I'm thankful so much that you would sit down and listen to these with me. So please make sure you come back next Wednesday for another brand new terrifying tale. And I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon backers, and in particular our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names on the program. And they are Bobbletopia.com, Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Brent McCullough, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. If you want to join the 90 folks who are hanging out with us over on Patreon, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and pledge whatever you can afford per month and get bonus episodes, more content than you could shake a stick at, and so much more. But now, it's time for me to get out of here. So for myself, my executive producer Rob Fields, my producer Dan Wilder, and our composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you next time. Stay cool.